Okay, welcome everyone to the first of a series of lectures hosted here over the digital medium of Zoom on behalf of Rising Tide. So, yeah, once again, welcome everybody from around the world. What we decided to do, for those who don't know, a few months ago at the end of March, we had planned a conference out under the theme of the Renaissance principle in universal history. And that was supposed to happen at the end of March. Now, as we know, certain things got in the way of that conference, and it didn't happen. And so instead of just waiting indefinitely, we decided to start opening up a new platform here over Zoom to allow those who were scheduled to speak to get a chance to showcase their ideas. Now, Aaron is going to be leaving for a project for several months in a few days. So this was the last chance he'd have to speak and to give his presentation. Now, can everyone see the poster here, Art, Science, and Civilization, with the picture of Plato and Augustine? Plato and Aristotle?
Yeah, I can see.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So this was the schedule originally. We were meant to have a presentation on Cicero's fight to save the soul of Rome by Cynthia here to my right, and who's sitting on to your left. We have Augustine's defense of Platonic Christianity, but it's going to be a little bit more than that in this presentation today. We had the presentation, the Tang Dynasty's Silk Road and the Jewish-Muslim-Christian Alliance, which was to be delivered by myself. And our friend Assad was going to present a fresh look at the Arab Renaissance. Now, this will be the first. Next Sunday, we're going to do another lecture featuring one of these presentations, and that'll be the case for the next 4 Sundays as a whole. Maybe a 5th and a 6th presentation might occur as well. And during the weekdays, we have our usual reading group meeting up, working through the writings of Plato and other great thinkers of the ages. The reason why we chose to put Plato and Aristotle on is because, I mean, a lot of people today have a bit of difficulty when they think about the past as something which happened. And it's, people will say, oh, I like Civil War history. That's my passion. Or I like, Indian history from the 7th to 18th century. That's what I studied. I got a PhD in that. Or I like ancient Greek history. And people will often localize their interests in history in space or in time or according to some culture. And there's 2 problems with this, which is, one, they lack a sense of universality because history itself is everybody, right, from the past. So you have every culture, every being who's ever existed, of every religion, is a part of the makeup of history. And history isn't something that just happened that we can talk about. It's something which we use as an insight into guiding our identity and our sense of the future, our ability to problem solve when certain patterns or certain problematic ideas arise in our world that are destroying our chances for a future. One of the best ways we can have to navigate through some stormy waters is the lessons of history. When did people fall prey to the same sets of ideas that caused a tragedy to unfold? Or when did people rise to the occasion and become heroic by breaking from their traditions that were destructive in order to ensure a renaissance? And so when you look at the figures of Plato versus Aristotle, even though they occurred, I mean, these 2 figures lived in the 4th century BC. Aristotle was younger than Plato, as Raphael conveyed in the Stanza della Signatura, the School of Athens mural, which today is in the Vatican, a place that desperately needs to revisit some of these lessons that not enough people are paying attention to in that world. But this painting portrays more than simply 2 philosophers obviously having a dispute. What we have is Plato there holding his Timaeus, pointing upwards, and we have Aristotle holding his famous ethics, Nicomachean ethics, sort of in a static state of motion, with his hand obviously portrayed downwards. That dispute between 2 schools of philosophy is very important because the idea that causality originates in the metaphysical domain of ideas and principles that are beyond the world of becoming, that's always changing, that's material, that world that Plato embodied is something which we've seen discovered by many different cultures around the world, that causality cannot be found in the purely mechanical, physical domain, but there's a higher domain of principle. Aristotle, on the other hand, and his idea that, ultimately, no, there's just matter is the cause of matter, that there's no ultimate deeper principle of creation in the Aristotelian world. That idea has also expressed itself in various forms in many cultures around the world in time. And the two different sets of systems of human organization, how you define a human being, how you define law, how you define government, past and the future, how you define ideas and judge ideas, is going to be, you might use a lot of the same words if you're an Aristotelian or a Platonist, but I can tell you, the meaning and the value of those words are in two different universes. They are not the same thing. So this is something which will guide us through all four presentations and maybe a fifth presentation as well to be determined. Aaron, I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years. He has been a friend, a collaborator with the Rising Tide Foundation. Cynthia and I have had the pleasure of doing joint presentations with him in our last several conferences. And he's a student of the Liberal Arts College of Concordia, where we do many of our conferences, and has specialized in community and public affairs. Aaron has graciously offered his time today to deliver some thoughts and share in this discussion on Saint Augustine. And I think with that, I will leave the platform to him.
Thank you. I actually want to kind of slightly piggyback off of what you're saying to mention the point of, so I have a liberal arts education. That's a great books education, which means that essentially I've had the opportunity over the last 3 years to read from the Western canon also. So reading from the Old Testament to the New Testament and following suit, over the last 2,000 years, all of the great thinkers, all of the great ideas that essentially have been put out in Western civilization. But that being said, I noticed myself when entering into this program, who had already kind of gone on my own personal journey of trying to discover quote unquote truth in my own way, that I even realized that my relationship with the books that we were learning was slightly different than some of my peers. And why I bring that up is that I think sometimes when we think of what a philosophy is, we think it's an opinion, or like I have a philosophy about this. But I think at least by the definition of Plato, that a philosophy is a complete orientation of the soul, meaning that every single thing that you kind of interact and act with, you're interacting and acting with a certain orientation that is towards truth, meaning that you're always trying to find the truth in things. That doesn't always mean that you find the truth. In fact, more often than not, you don't find the truth, because we're human beings, we're limited. Our capacity to really understand the true reality of the universe is very difficult. But as long as we're oriented towards that thing, then we have a greater potential of finding, I guess what is best defined as human happiness or human meaning while we're living here in this world. And so that being said, today I'm going to be presenting Augustine, and even to a certain degree, in his own life and in his own lived experience, which was that of the falling Roman Empire, he realized that one of the biggest issues that Romans struggled with prior to even to seeing their empire fall was this question of what human happiness is. And essentially, we're going to look at some quotes later on. And to be honest, it was really difficult to find good quotes to have a discussion about, because the book is just so dense and so full of ideas. But I think these are some of the better quotes that at least we can have a fruitful conversation about. But that essentially his main criticism is that in the foundation of Rome is these false ideologies, these false philosophies. And so no matter what virtues or no matter what Rome achieved, ultimately its destruction was already written into its foundation. That an empire that is essentially founded through conquest and bloodthirst and oppression and all of these different things are destined at whatever time to essentially fall and succumb to those same things. Now, what's so unique, however, about the fall of the Roman Empire is that you had these barbarian kingdoms, so to say, who were Christian. And so what we saw, or what Augustine says was seen at the time, is that a lot of these so-called pagans and legitimate Christians would find themselves in a time of their nation being invaded, that they would be able to find solace and safety in churches. And what's so interesting about that is that if anybody is kind of up to date on ancient epics, so, you know, tales of war and conquest, you'll find that in no other period in history do you really see the same type of respect from an invading army into another nation's land. So I don't know if it's possible, Matt, actually to share the image of Rome.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
This is just for a visual. There's nothing really on the map that you have to pay attention to, but I just want everybody to see what we're talking about, what the fall of Rome looked like. I suppose that's an image of Saint Augustine.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's that's a very good image of Saint Augustine. Very good. Very Renaissance.
So are you saying that the Christians, when they invaded, they were not so bad as the Romans?
Well, so, and we'll look at a quote later on in the words of Augustine, how he sees it. But essentially, what you had is that these invading forces who were Christian would essentially, in the name of Christ, give mercy to the invading people. And so the particular example he gives is that you have people essentially going into the churches, and they had found safety in the churches. And a kind of counter example he gives historically is in the Aeneid, which is the Roman founding mythology, right? So Aeneid is a Trojan who leaves Troy after it's sacked by the Greeks and goes and conquers Italy to eventually found the city of Rome. And he brings up this point that when the Greeks and even the Romans, right, so whether it's the Greeks invading Troy or the Romans invading Italy, you see that a common practice in these epics is that they will go and slaughter all of the priests in the temples, that there is absolutely no regard for these divinities, so to say. Now, I'm going to continue to just discussing this point, and then we can really look at the quotes, because I think that is really where we're going to have a great discussion. So the whole foundation of Augustine's argument is partly mythological and partly based in the kind of philosophical orientation of the Platonists. And this is to say that by no means does Augustine think that Plato got it right? So Augustine will kind of criticize his philosophy that love as a demon or as a spirit is the way towards God. He'll agree that love, you know, you have to love like Christ, or you have to have this Christ type of love inside you to be a good Christian, but he'll argue the kind of semantics on whether or not this is an actual entity that can come and inhabit your body and have power over you. But what he'll say about the Platonists is that essentially what they did get right is the understanding and the recognition that finding quote unquote God, or finding divinity, or finding trying to figure out the things about human beings that cannot just be simply perceived by the senses is not something that you can discover through the senses, that it's actually it's a process of belief and of faith, and that ultimately the only path towards quote unquote, you know, in the Christian point of view, salvation in the afterlife is through faith and not through necessarily any works and so on and so forth, which is actually something that you'll see later kind of Protestants start to adopt in their own philosophy. But again, that's kind of a whole other conversation. So if you can scroll down, I just want to actually look at the first quote.
Yeah, there's only one chair.
Linda, I believe you have to go on mute.
You could only do one chair?
Yeah.
Sorry. Hold on. I'm sorry. This is, let me just put this person on mute. Okay, let's do that again.
It was an interference?
A little bit of interference. It's okay.
It's okay. It's
Bound to happen. All right, here we are. Okay, back on track.
Alrighty. So if you can scroll down to the first quote.
Okay, a second. Okay.
A little bit further down, sorry. Okay, somewhat long, but I'm going to go read through the whole thing. So this is book 1, chapter 1. This is essentially how he opens up the book. For this earthly city belongs the enemies against whom I have to defend the city of God. Many of them, indeed, being reclaimed from their ungodly error, have become sufficiently credible citizens of this city. But many are so inflamed with hatred against it, and are so ungrateful for its Redeemer for his signal benefits, as to forget that they would now be unable to utter a single word to prejudice, had they not found in its sacred places, as they fled from the enemy's steel, that life in which they now boast themselves. Are not those very Romans who were spared by the barbarians through their respect for Christ become enemies of the name of Christ? The reliquaries of martyrs and the churches of the apostles bear witness to this. For in the sack of the city, there were open sanctuaries for all who fled to them, whether Christian or pagan. And indeed, when even those murderers who everywhere else showed themselves pitiless came to these spots where they had forbidden, where that was forbidden, which in the license of war permitted in every other place, their furious rage for slaughter was bridled, and their eagerness to take prisoners was quenched. And they ought to attribute it to the spirit of these Christian times, that contrary to the custom of war, these bloodthirsty barbarians spared them. Okay, great, but I'm in the middle of something. So sorry about that. And they ought to attribute it to the spirit of these Christian times, that contrary to the customs of war, these bloodthirsty barbarians spared them, and spared them for Christ's sake. Whether this mercy was actually shown in promiscuous places, or in the places specially dedicated to Christ's name, and of which the very largest were selected as sanctuaries, that full scope might thus be given to the expansive compassion which desired that large multitude to find shelter there. For of those who see insolently and shamelessly insulting the servants of Christ, there are numbers who would not have escaped that destruction and slaughter had they not pretended they themselves were Christ's servants. Yet now, in the ungrateful pride of most impious madness, and at the risk of being punished in everlasting darkness, they previously opposed the name under which they fraudulently pretended themselves the sake of enjoying life in the light in the brief life. So essentially, to answer the question that was asked earlier, this is what Augustine is seeing at the time, is that you have, whether Christian or pagan, people recognizing that these places are becoming safe havens. Now, regardless of like what the and I want to kind of open it up to discussion, but this is definitely what I thought in my mind when I was originally reading this, was regardless of what the kind of spiritual or philosophical reasons behind these things are, it's really interesting how much power this belief system had over these invading forces. Because again, like if you think about it, up to that time and even after that time, you don't necessarily see this type of mercy shown. And I think of another great example is I think his name was Suleiman, but he was one of the Seljuk invaders of Judea, and after conquering Jerusalem, had essentially given the Christians who were there at the time either free leave or conversion, but essentially said he wouldn't slaughter them. And so in this kind of foundational system, which comes from the Judeo kind of Old Testament law of Moses, let's say, or the old law, comes this kind of universalizing attribute to what human beings are. So prior to this period, right, if you were a follower of Bacchus, or if you were just of another nation, you essentially, like, you as like the winner were justified in dehumanizing these people and turning them into slaves, or murdering them, or raping them, or essentially doing whatever you can, because those were the laws of war. And so it's permitted under the laws of war. And funny enough, Augustine does talk about this. I didn't put it as a quote, but he even mentions how rape is illegal in Rome. You can't go around just raping Roman citizens. But if you invade a foreign land, it's justified by the laws of war. So there's this kind of arbitrariness already to the kind of pagan pantheon of gods and of laws that is already kind of baked into the foundation. If we can go to the next quote. Or does anybody, I guess, have thoughts or anything that they'd like to, I guess?
Well, the Byzantine, I know that in the history of Islam, they were seen as a kind of cruel, controlling the Arabia and other, there, as a kind of imperialist force, the later Christianity adapted and became like the Roman,
Yeah.
pillaging. So, but you're saying originally Augustine and that's it's the city of God where you're reading from, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So, is that correct then?
Well, I mean, look, it's you're asking a question about people who might have acted unjustly and an ideology. So, like, again, even what Augustine says, if I'm to believe wholly that no Christians or no people were slaughtered by these Christian forces, then I might be a little naive to say that. But my interpretation of at least what Augustine is saying, and frankly of, if you look at the development of Western civilization, right, like eventually we over time at least, we start to perceive certain things that were kind of permitted by the laws of war as being immoral, regardless of who the people you're invading are, right? Even if people did still conduct that morally or ethically or legally, we eventually put these things into writing, that these things are not justifiable. And I would say that fundamentally that foundation is the kind of Judeo-Christian Muslim ethos, right? This belief in a divine unified sense of justice that is for all people and not just one particular group or one particular group following a god.
Until we get to the Crusades.
Right. And I'm like, again, you could probably bring up many examples in history of any religious group committing atrocities in the name of their god. But I think again, like what Augustine is getting at here is that at least prior to this point, you have never seen what was happening during the fall of the Roman Empire. You have never seen an invading force essentially come into another and spare people based off of some shared sense of identity, which is being a Christian. Now, again, whatever whatever actually happened on the ground, we don't know, right? And we only have what we know from history to inform us. So yeah, I'm sure things did happen. I'm not saying that it didn't, but at least from the philosophical background, that this was something that was unique in that time period in history. This wasn't something that was happening before. And at least with what we know, right? Again, that's why I brought up the epics. If you were to read the Iliad, or if you were to read the Aeneid, or if you're to read, what's the one from Babylon?
Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh, right? Like you see that historically, at least in the Western canon, or you learn about the conquest of Alexander, or essentially any other historical event, you see that they're really like, it wasn't even a question. It's like, if you worship this god, I'm justified in killing you and murdering all your family. So this is something that is unique at that time, I would say.
New Testament, not the Old Testament. The Old Testament's just as blood and guts as Iliad.
Yeah, and I think that this is where the Christian sense of things, the idea of like a universal love, which again it is founded in the Jewish Hebrew tradition, but had to be expanded on essentially through this character of Jesus, essentially the Isaiah concept of circumcising the foreskin of your heart, as opposed to just simply following laws and rules. So if nobody else has anything to say, we can move on to the next quote. Okay. So here Augustine is essentially going to be giving us an example of virtue in the Roman Empire prior to Christianity, or these kind of higher ideas, and he's using this as an example of virtue misplaced, or of an honor or a respect due to a god that has been misplaced. And this comes up because a lot of Romans and pagans at the time were essentially accusing Christians of being the reason why Rome fell, because Romans stopped worshiping the gods, and so therefore the gods were punishing them in the temporal world. So I'll go through this quote. But among their own famous men, they have a very noble example of a voluntary endurance of captivity in the obedience of religious scruple. Marcus Attilius Regulus, a Roman general, was a prisoner in the hands of Carthaginians. But they, being more anxious to exchange their prisoners with the Romans than to keep them, sent Regulus as a special envoy with their own ambassadors to negotiate this exchange. But bound him first with an oath, and that if he failed to accomplish this wish, he would return to Carthage. He went and persuaded the Senate to the opposite course, because he believed it was not for the advantage of the Roman Republic to make an exchange of a prisoner. After he had thus exerted his influence, the Romans did not compel him to return to the enemy, but what he had sworn he voluntarily performed. The Carthaginians put him to death with refined, elaborate, and horrible tortures. With justice, indeed, do they applaud the virtue which rose superior to frightful of fate, superior to so frightful a fate. However, the gods he swore by were those who are now supposed to avenge the prohibition of their worship by inflicting these present calamities on the human race. And this is what he's talking about when this is the fall of Rome that he's mentioning. But if these gods, who were worshipped specifically in this behalf, that they might confer happiness in this life, either willed or permitted these punishments to be inflicted on one who kept his oath to them, what more cruel punishment could they, in their anger, have inflicted on a person? But why may I not draw from my reasoning a double inference? Regulus certainly had such reverence for the gods that, for his oath's sake, he would neither remain in his own land nor go elsewhere, but without hesitation return to his bitterest enemies. If he thought that this course would be advantageous with respect to the present life, he was certainly much deceived, for it brought his life to a frightful termination. By his own example, in fact, he taught that the gods do not secure temporal happiness of their worshippers, since he himself, who was devoted to their worship, was both conquered in battle and taken prisoner. And then, because he refused to act in violation of the oath he had sworn by them, was tortured and put to death by a new and hitherto unheard of and all too horrible kind of punishment. And on the supposition that the worshippers of the gods are rewarded by felicity in the life to come, why then do they culminate the influence of Christianity? Why do they assert that this disaster has overtaken the city because it has ceased worshiping of the gods? Since worship them as assiduously as they may yet be as unfortunate as Regulus was? Or will someone carry so wonderfully a blindness to the extent of wildly and tempting, in the face of evident truth, to contend that though one man might be unfortunate, though a worshipper of the gods, yet a whole city could not be so? That is to say, the power of their gods is better adapted to preserve multitudes than individuals, as if multitudes were not composed of individuals. So if anybody wants to say anything, they can add after this, but this is essentially a beginning of the argument of salvation in Augustine's point of view. That what was previously thought up to this point is that in worshiping the gods and in producing sacrifices for the gods, or going to war in the name of gods, would somehow, if not guarantee you some form of happiness and fame, that's really the better word, fame in this life, that at least that you would get some sort of reward in the afterlife. And so another great example I think of also comes from Aeneid, which is the Roman founding story, when Aeneas meets Achilles in the underworld. And upon a meeting Achilles, he says, how can such a great warrior, such a famed warrior, be here in the underworld? And the whole story continues that essentially Achilles is the king of the underworld, that he rules in the underworld. But when asked, would you rather go back to the living world, or go back to the living world and essentially just be a soldier in the army, or be a king here, Achilles' response is, I would much rather go and be a soldier in the living world. So even by the Romans' own account, there's this kind of this acknowledgement in the arbitrariness of how the gods dish out justice. Yeah, so I don't know. I guess I found that to be extremely fascinating, because I think what it relates to today, at least in my thinking, is that a lot of us are in high pursuit of material fame to a certain degree, right? Whether it's in having nice things, in a certain reputation, maybe being part of a political party, like whatever it may be, that we focus so much on the external parts of our belief systems, of like how it's portrayed into the world, how other people see us, as opposed to maybe questioning internally what the reasons why we may be doing certain things and what those consequences might be. So, Regulus, as the example, thought that by, committing himself to his oath, he would be somehow spared the torture, or possibly might have been seen as a virtuous and just person, and maybe the Carthaginians, who knows what could have happened. He did gain fame. He lives on in history, at least until the time of the Romans. Maybe not many people know of him now, but he gained some fame, but at what cost? Yeah. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to the discussion. Okay, so we can go to the next quote.
Okay.
So at this point, I've skipped pretty much halfway through the book. And at this section in the book, there's many chapters where he essentially is going through a dialogue between contemporary Platonists at his time, his own relationship with Platonic philosophy, his disagreements, his agreements, so on and so forth. So I thought that this was like the best paragraph to essentially sum up that whole like 200-page dialogue that he was having. So he goes like this. Among the disciples of Socrates, Plato was the one who shone with glory which far excelled that of others, and who not unjustly eclipsed them all. By birth of an Athenian of honorable parentage, he far surpassed his fellow disciples in natural endowments, of which he was possessed in a wonderful degree. Yet, deeming himself in the Socratic discipline far from sufficient for bringing philosophy to perfection, he traveled as extensively as he was able, going to every place famed for the cultivation of any science of which he could make himself master. Thus, he learned from the Egyptians whatever they held and taught as important, and from Egypt passing into those parts of Italy which were filled with the fame of the Pythagoreans. He mastered with the greatest facility and under the most eminent teachers all the Italic philosophy which was then in vogue. I'm sorry, 1 second. And as he had peculiar love for his master Socrates, he made him the speaker in all his dialogues, putting into his mouth whatever he had learned, either from others or from the effort of his own powerful intellect, tempering even his moral disputations with the grace and politeness of the Socratic style. And as the study of wisdom consists in action and contemplation, so that one part of it may be called active and the others contemplative, then the active part having reference to the conduct of life, that is, to the regulation of morals, and the contemplative part to the investigation into the causes of nature and into pure truth. Socrates is said to have excelled in the active part of the study, while Pythagoras gave more attention to the contemplative part, on which he brought to bear all the force of his great intellect. To Plato is given the praise of having perfected philosophy by combining both parts into one. He then divides it into 3 parts. The first moral, which is chiefly occupied with action, the second natural, of which the object is contemplation, and the third rational, which discriminates between the true and false. And although this last is necessary both to action and contemplation, it is contemplation nevertheless, which has peculiar claim to the office of investigating the nature of truth. Thus, this tripartite division is not contrary to that which made the study of wisdom to consist in action of contemplation. Now, as to what Plato thought with respect to each of these parts, that is, what he believed to be the end of all actions and the cause of all natures and the light of all intelligences, it would be a question too long to discuss, and about which we ought not to make any rash affirmations. For as Plato liked and constantly affected the well-known method of his master Socrates, namely that of dissimulating his knowledge and of his opinions. It is not easy to discover clearly what he himself thought on various matters, and more than it is to discover what were the real opinions of Socrates. We must nevertheless insert into our work certain of those opinions which he expressed in his writings, whether he himself uttered them or narrates them as expressed by others and seems himself to approve of. Opinions sometimes favorable to the true religion, which our faith takes up and defends, just go down, and sometimes contrary to it, as, for example, in the questions concerning the existence of one God, or of many, as it relates to the truly blessed life, which is to be after death. For those who are praised as having most closely followed Plato, who is justly preferred to the other philosophers of the Gentiles, and who are said to have manifested the greatest acuteness in understanding him, do perhaps entertain such an idea of God as to admit that in him are to be found the cause of existence, the ultimate reason for understanding, and the end in reference to which the whole life is to be regulated. Of which three things: the first is understood to pertain to the natural, the second to the rational, and the third to the moral part of philosophy. For if man has to be created as to attain, though that which is most excellent in him, to that which excels all things, that is, to the one true absolute good God, without whom no nature exists, no doctrine instructs, no exercise profits, let him be sought in whom all things are secure to us. Let him be discovered in whom all truth becomes certain to us. Let him be loved in whom all becomes right to us. So it's a little bit, this is maybe one of his more religious kind of quotes that I chose. But I chose this partly because prior to pointing this out, he kind of makes a sarcastic, he sarcastically essentially says that had the Romans created temples to Plato as opposed to the other gods, that they might have found themselves in better situation up to this point. And he mentions a little bit later on about the gods of Egypt, who in his mind, he's saying that these were prophets, essentially prophets of God, with different interpretations of God, and then were later turned into deities by the Egyptians. And I guess what this brought to my mind when I was originally reading this is that although Augustine is a Christian, and although at the time there are many branches of Christianity, there's just many branches of Christianity depending on what part of the empire you were in at the time, that there was this one particular group that among all of the other group kind of shown as being the most Christian without actually being Christian, right? So a lot of Platonists weren't necessarily Christian. There were some prolific Christians who were Platonists, but it wasn't to say that all the Platonists were Christians. Yet among all of the group of the Gentiles, this was the one group that you were essentially able to have a philosophical dialogue with about the true nature of the universe and the true nature of human happiness. And I think that relates to today because, I think when Matt gives his presentation on the Muslim Jewish Christian alliance, I think that today we struggle in different interpretations, right? So we might, and whether that's religious, political, social, that everybody has a slightly different interpretation on how things ought to be. But that manifestly at the end of the day, you do have to get together and work on things. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can work with every group, because not every group will necessarily be able to see 100% eye to eye, and that it is important that when we choose our allies, when we necessarily have to choose our allies, that we at least choose people who, for the most part, can understand and see a common ground in the philosophy that I guess we're trying to live out in our own lives. And so, I find that interesting that at the time, Augustine, who in a lot of cases is not very forgiving of other philosophers or other pagan belief system, in this case, is kind of able to, essentially see truth in their philosophies. And so, Augustine talks about this more in his Confessions, where he actually goes through his education from Manichaeism to his introduction to the Platonists and to eventually his conversion into Christianity. And he says in his confessions that it was through the discussions he was having with Platonists, because just for those who don't know, Augustine was not always a Christian. He converted later on in life. His mother was a Christian, his father wasn't. But it was through these discussions with Platonists that essentially he found his own faith. It's essentially the process that he describes in the Confession is very similar to that process described in Plato's Symposium, which, for those who haven't read the Symposium, is essentially through loving an individual, seeing the universality in that individual, kind of a rational step from recognizing that all people have the same capacity to for your love, and that it's essentially this ladder till eventually you realize that the highest form of beauty is wisdom, and that to love wisdom is the highest form of love. And so in this case, it would be to love Christ, or to love God is the highest form of love, because God is the creator and the wisest of all things.
I can hear the ecclesiasm.
Yeah. What do you mean by that?
But in the book of Ecclesiastes, this is the first thing you should search: wisdom. Search for wisdom. And not only the Ecclesiastes, and the proverb, I think too. Proverb, and but Ecclesiastes is the top.
Yeah, and I think,
and Monsieur Augustine, he was very stubborn about Christianity.
Yes.
Until he met Saint Ambrose.
Yes.
And that's why, because the intelligence, the power of reason, it was the problem. And that's the way we have today. It's exactly the same. There is no reason in Christianity, actually. If you follow the Christian world, this is very strange, actually.
Well, and so I'm Jewish, and I've had the same arguments with rabbis that there's a that you have faith, and I think faith is like the life force. It's the thing that keeps you moving forward, but you need to have reason. You need to really understand why you're doing what you're doing.
Exactly. Why you have faith. Why you have faith or you don't. Yeah. But I didn't know. What branch are you, by the way?
Just Jewish.
You are Jewish. You said you're Jewish. But why you say you are Jewish? Are you sure?
Yeah, 100%.
Well, mate, because of diaspora, everybody's mixed,
Yeah.
So what is the pure?
Not a genetic thing.
How you can say I'm Jewish?
Yeah, it's not necessarily a genetic thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but it is also it's complicated. It's not like, it's an ideological thing, it's a belief system, it's a cultural thing, but then it is also who your parents are. It is also who your ancestors are.
This is cool.
They believe, and that's what they follow. However, what I would argue is that if my reason alone was because my mother's Jewish,
that way it comes from the mother.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that if that was my sole reason, then who knows? Maybe I'm not. But you have to actually. So you have your belief first. I trust and I believe in my ancestors. I trust and I believe in my parents and in my grandparents. Yes. However, I do my own investigation. I do my own research. I actually look at it and I try to figure out if what I feel in my soul is in line with what I'm told is my cultural or historical tradition. What I think is interesting about Augustine is kind of to what you're saying, and I'm glad you brought up Saint Ambrose, because in the Confession, Augustine talks about the Manichaeists, and essentially the main criticism he has of the Manichaeists is this dichotomy of good and evil, that there is evil in the world and there is good in the world, and he says that at a young age when he would hear these things or he'd be teaching these things, he would always think back to this time when he was a child, when he stole pears off of a pear tree. And he would think to himself, but I'm not a bad person. I did something bad, but I'm not a bad person. So, and like, whatever was the reason, whether it was just being a rebellious youth or not, he kind of was turned off by the Christian religion. It was only after, it was even before St. Ambrose, it was his friend,
Atticus?
no, it starts with an N. It was a friend who died. One of his friends died, and essentially it was in trying to deal with the sadness of his loss, he started to realize that like, it can't be just like, it's not something that is within myself. Like, there's not this life force necessarily inside myself that is what is keeping me going forward. There's something else. There's something about the future and the potential that is allowing me to appreciate the friendship I have, be at peace with the loss that I have, and also kind of feel that things might be better for him, right? It might be better because there's a lot of suffering in the living world, which I think opened his own heart to the potential of becoming a Christian long before he even met St. Ambrose. And I think that what St. Ambrose allowed was for him to connect what he was feeling inside himself to the actual intellectual understanding of the Gospels and of, like, you know, the Christian Platonist branch of Christianity. Because even today, right, you know, you look at evangelicals or essentially maybe most branches of Christianity, it's just blind faith, or at least that's what's promoted.
Exactly.
And that's difficult.
But it depends of the rationality of the pastor, or it's close, very close to the rabbi system.
Yeah,
it's close to, but except the Catholic Church.
Well, the Catholic
Church, you have only one doctrine, and all the Catholic Church supposed to follow that.
Yeah.
But we are in the en français, I will say. Do you speak French a bit?
Moi, je parle français.
Tu parles français?
Ouais.
Most people on this call might not speak French, though, just so you guys know.
Et entre moi et toi, c'est quoi?
C'est que je crois qu'actuellement, tous les mouvements religieux actuellement sont en train de chavirer en ce moment. C'est comme le navire. Les navires, ils sont en train de pas de couler, mais de chavirer, et ils vont couler.
Yeah.
Je crois que c'est ce qui se passe en ce moment. C'est vraiment... Parce que c'est totalement irrationnel. Si on regarde par exemple, là, avec la chute de Rome dans le temps de...
I would ask you, Patrick, I would ask you, though, most people on this call don't speak French, so...
Okay. Unfortunately, okay. Yeah, and because the relation is very interesting about what the city of God, during the time he wrote the city of God, the collapse of the Roman Empire, all the irrationality. And nowadays, the situation we are in, actually, it's totally irrational. And people don't see, the people don't understand that it's irrational. Our government is irrational. Everything is irrational.
So just to, I guess, kind of keep it moving forward for now, I'll end this quote on this point, and I think it relates to, I forget who the gentleman's name was who mentioned this earlier about, you know, the Byzantines and later Christians and how they acted. I think part of why you see, and so what Patrick was saying earlier is that essentially he feels like religions are disintegrating, that, you know, maybe it's not a complete collapse, but we are seeing that, like, maybe people are still spiritual, but they're definitely not religious. They're definitely from
thirsty.
Sorry?
They are thirsty, but they don't want to hear the one God. Because all the truth come from Abraham. Yeah. And we are linked to Abraham. The Muslim, they are linked to Abraham.
Yeah.
Jewish, they are with Abraham, and the Christianity with Abraham too.
Yeah. But again, I think, and I'm not disagreeing with you, I just think that why are things disintegrating? I think it's because whatever the moral code may be, it hasn't been followed. And I think that over time, right, maybe you can justify it 200 years, but after a while you start to see, after one generation after another, you say, look, I'm seeing these doctrines, I can read these doctrines, this is what it says, you're not following it. So I think most people reasonably so, doesn't mean it's justified, but reasonably so will say, well, then this must mean that these doctrines are just lies, or they're means of manipulating us into following this
Unfortunately, you're right.
Or they just lose trust in the institutions and they go on their own paths. The more dangerous thing, really, is believing that they're lies and believing that they're forms of manipulation. I think that that's where we are today. We're at a point today where the laws and the ethics, all the things that essentially are the foundation of Western civilization, are perceived as essentially being just a cookbook for quote unquote, white men to oppress people. Maybe it's been used that way, but I don't think that fundamentally that is what the doctrine was in its essence meant to do. I think that's what people do. People find ways of manipulating and changing things.
Whatever. Big scam.
Yeah. So we can move on to the next quote.
I've got the City of God here in French.
Oh, very good.
And
next
then I'm the with the right page, the famous book 8. Okay. Now with book 11.
All right, Aaron.
Yeah.
We're.
Hold on, I just want to see how many other quotes I have. These are very long.
Do you want me to scroll down for you?
Just give me 1 second. City of God.
Oh.
Okay, so just 2 more quotes then. Am I correct? Is that what I'm seeing?
That's what I got.
Okay, great. Okay, so before I go into this quote, I want to explain something that I haven't explained up to this point, which is the essential, the core argument that Augustine is trying to make outside of criticizing Rome for its lack of virtues and trying to defend Christians. And that is that there are these 2 cities that exist in the universe. One is the earthly city, which we're all very familiar with. We live in them, we prosper in them, we have families in them, we die in them. That is the earthly city. But then there's the city of God. And that's a city that does not exist in the temporal or material world.
Yes.
Now, Augustine admits that Rome excelled at building the earthly city. Rome excelled at building monuments. It excelled at building aqueducts. It excelled at building roads and cities. But what it lacked was building up the spiritual city within individuals so that they can find themselves, when they find themselves at the gates of heaven, that they're able to essentially enter into the city of God. And just so we're all aware, right, a lot of the language that Christians use later on, right, in Christian history, it does essentially come back to this philosophical discourse that Augustine was having with other Christians and pagans at his own time. This concept of a city of God, yes, that's found in the scripture, but really the philosophical basis of this is really found in a lot of Augustine's work. So now what he argues is that essentially we can't disregard the earthly city. However, if we make it our main priority, meaning that if we only aim at the earthly city, then not only do we not find ourselves with the opportunity of salvation and therefore the opportunity to actually enter into the city of God, but we also risk at bringing in all of the negative and demonic type spirits into this world by simply focusing on the earthly city. And I think part of why he makes this argument is based off of just what he sees on a kind of day-to-day basis. He does mention like the system of sacrifices that people will come in, bring whether it's like livestock or something for sacrifices, hoping that they will get some sort of recompense from these gods. And so to him, it's not just like, oh, like don't just worry about your job and so on and so forth. Like the practical things, he's also saying, if you think that you're going to get anything by giving a sacrifice to so-and-so idol, that's not going to happen, right? Because these are things that are created by man and not be created by God, and therefore you're still focusing on the earthly city. And he essentially makes the argument that, again, not to neglect the earthly city, but that if you were to focus on the city of God and getting into the city of God, that every single act of building that you do in the earthly world will be good and just and so forth. So we'll bring up the quote now, and I'll read that out. So The city of God we speak of is the same to which testimony is borne by that scripture, which excels all the writings of all nations by its divine authority, and has brought under its influence all kinds of minds. And this not by a casual intellectual movement, but obviously by an express providential arrangement. For there it is written, glorious things are spoken of thee, O city of God. And in another psalm we read, great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised is the city of our God in the mountain of his holiness, increasing the joy of the whole earth. And a little after, in the same psalm, as we have heard, so have we seen the city of the Lord's hosts, in the city of our God. God has established it forever. And in another, there is a river, the streams whereof shall make glad the city of our God, the holy place of the tabernacles of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. From these and similar testimonies, all of which it were tedious to cite, we have learned that there is a city of God, and its founders has inspired us with the love which makes us covet its citizenship. To this founder of the holy city of citizens, of the earthly city, to this founder of the holy city, the citizens of the earthly city prefer their own gods, not knowing that he is the God of gods, not of false, of impious and proud gods, who, being deprived of his unchangeable and freely communicated light, and so reduced to a kind of poverty-stricken power, eagerly grasp at their own private privileges, and seek divine honors from their deluded subjects, but of the pious and holy gods, who are better pleased to submit themselves to one than to subject many to themselves, and who would rather worship God than be worshipped as a god. He's rolling a bit. So essentially, he's talking about angels. That's one thing that is difficult as a modern person, especially reading this book, is that the word gods, demons, spirits, angels, these are all essentially interchangeable. I don't really know like where that comes from, or like how that came about linguistically. Like I do know, reading when I read the Symposium, I was surprised to see that love was referred to as a demon. So again, like I don't know if anybody else knows more about that, and like where the linguistic.
Yeah.
That always sounds very interesting.
Yeah, demon has a different root word in Greek and Koinian Greek.
And what's the difference between the words?
It's like it's a divine power. It means like it doesn't really have a different word originally from like say angel.
Mm-hmm.
So also like words that get interchanged are like in the early period of the early church, before like let's say Saint Irenaeus was archons and aeons. Those could be used like interchangeably. So you kind of have like, we think of like angels and demons, right? Like the good ones and the bad ones. But at this time when writing, it doesn't mean that love is a demon, is my point. Sorry. Briefly, in the way that we think of it, but it is a independently existing entity.
Right.
You know, I would call it an angel would be like a better translation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Alrighty. So
You're here.
Yeah. But to the enemy, thank you. But to the enemies of this city, we have replied in 10 preceding books, according to our ability and the help afforded by our Lord and King. Now, recognizing what is to be expected of me and not unmindful of our promise and relying on the same succor, I will endeavor to treat of the origin and progress, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, I want to go on to the next chapter. He's essentially saying what he's going to be doing in this chapter. But this is what I found to be kind of, I guess, an interesting way of expressing how God interacts with us. So he goes on to say, it is a great and very rare thing for man, after he has contemplated the whole creation, corporeal and incorporeal, and has discerned its mutability, to pass beyond it, and by the continued soaring of his mind to attain to the unchangeable substance of God, and in the height of contemplation to learn from God himself that none but he has made all things, all that is not of the divine essence. For God speaks to man not by means of some audible creature dining in his ears, so that atmospheric vibrations connect him, that makes with him the hears that hears the sound. Not even by means of spiritual being, a being with the semblance of a body, such as we see in the dreams, such as we see in dreams or similar states. And just to point out, right, like, I think later Christians will come up with these ideas of, like, you know, Satan kind of embodying himself in an attractive man to seduce people. Clearly, I think Augustine here would think that that's ridiculous. Not by these, then, does God speak, but by truth itself. If anyone is prepared to hear with the mind rather than with the body. For he speaks to that part of man which is better than all else that is in him, and then which God himself alone is better. For since man is more properly understood, or if that cannot be, then at least believed to be made in God's image, no doubt it is that part of him by which he rises above those lower parts he has in common with the beasts, which brings him nearer to the supreme. But since the mind itself, though naturally capable of reason and intelligence, is disabled by besotting and inveterate vices, not merely from delighting and abiding in, but even from tolerating his unchangeable light, until it has been gradually healed and renewed and made capable of such felicity, it had in the first place to be impregnated with faith, and so purified. And that in this faith it might advance the more confidently towards the truth itself, God's Son, assuming humanity without destroying his divinity, established and founded this faith, and there might be a way for man to man's God through a God man. I'm sure in the Latin this probably sounded a lot better. So I'm not going to finish reading the rest of the quote because it's kind of self-evident that essentially, kind of what Patrick and I were discussing earlier, is that there is a faith, like man is just born naturally with a capacity for faith, for belief. And that if you direct that faith towards anything other than truth or God, or, you know, in this case, Jesus, then essentially you're bound to go and harm yourself. And so that for a human being who is naturally endowed with this capacity for faith to live a good life, a meaningful life, and then find themselves in the afterlife in heaven, then therefore they have to orientate their entire soul to the truth. That is extremely, extremely similar to what Plato talks about through Socrates, of this kind of orientation of a person.
But there's almost a contradiction there, right? In the, sorry, I kind of butted. In that applying yourself to that truth, you're essentially going to end up questioning that faith.
Yeah. And he does it in this very paragraph, right? Because he says, we know man is made in the image of God, or we believe it.
Yeah.
So I think that's humility to a certain degree, right? It's, I think it is almost an act, like maybe that's what you're saying. It's almost an act of faith to be like, you know, like I believe it, it's in my core, but like to say I know it, that's almost hubris.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you mean too, like when you believe something and you put it into action in life, like the belief that man is made in the image of God, you see so many examples of man not behaving like he's in the image of God, which challenges the belief. Yeah. Like that tests your faith because there's so much ugly or bad, ungodly behavior you encounter all around you.
Exactly.
Well,
yeah.
I'm saying I know God doesn't exist because of all the terrible things human beings do.
Right. I mean, I actually remember, I can't say who it was, but might have been Cusa, where he speaks about atheism and almost says, well, of course this would exist because the intelligent man has to pass through certain periods of struggle in his faith, of doubt in God, because living the physical life on earth, you are going to struggle, you're going to see suffering, you're going to see things that torture you essentially, and that is going to lead you to, you know, an all about process of questioning whether God, you know, not only whether God exists, but whether God is good, because like you're about to say that you know, to live in a world where there's so much bad, like a lot of people fall into that trap of, well, how can God exist if you know, such things as poverty exist and so on and so forth.
This kind of this is a very great issue here, because if you are I don't want to insult person about that, but if you are not mature, you will reject totally God, because the bad God is not for the young people. It's not for baby. Okay, that's the problem of Vatican II, because they destroy the will of the man. It's not easy to explain in English, because my French is so. People reject God. That's why we have so mad. That's the principle.
Yeah.
If people reject God, it's over. That's the Renaissance. The true Renaissance. It's the renewal of the intelligence, and the search for wisdom, the intelligence, wisdom. It's to admit that all the creation come from God, because if you reject God, there is no sense at all. Nothing will tie together, even science, and nothing. Science will not work.
Yeah,
because it will be a lottery. That's why all the science nowadays repose on hazard. By hazard, the life came from hazard. It's not hazard. It's a plan. It's a lovely plan.
Yeah.
I think you're saying hazard and you mean randomly.
Yeah, randomly.
Yeah.
And most of the philosophers today, they will say that if you believe, especially in Jesus Christ, you are stupid.
Yeah. I mean, look, like, right, I don't necessarily believe in Jesus Christ.
No.
Right?
The people,
your point, though,
people say, if you believe in God, even if it's Jewish or Muslims, you are stupid. If you believe in God.
But
you know what I mean?
He said, sorry, Patrick, just 1 second. I think there's something to be said, like, to this question of faith. I think blind faith is not good. We all agree on that.
Exactly. I totally agree with you. The problem is people, they are in the fideism.
In the what?
They are in the fideism. The fideism, it's
fidelity,
kind of a sola deo.
Yeah.
Or and the atheism is sola ratio.
Yeah.
That's the problem. But Larouche said you always, before believing something, you have always to construct by yourself the proof.
Yeah. There's this really interesting rabbinical parable. I've mentioned it probably so many times. Matt has heard me say this, but it's something that's stuck with me like really my entire life. And it's this saying that it's a young boy and a rabbi having a conversation. And the young boy asks the rabbi, why did God create atheists? So the rabbi asked the boy, well, when you do something good, why do you do something good? And he says, well, because God told me to do it. And he says, okay, well, when you've seen atheists do something good, why are they doing something good? And the boy thinks a little bit and he says, well, I guess it's because he thought that that was the right thing to do. He says, okay, so if you're walking in the street and you see somebody who's in need of help, rather than being religious and praying for God to help the person, be like an atheist, forget God for a second and do something to help them. And so I think that there's this, you know,
I'm not sure I understand the last part. I don't hear the last part.
So I don't know where you missed, but so essentially he asked the question: if you see somebody who needs help, like the atheists, don't leave it to God, right? Don't pray that God will help them. Forget God and just help the person.
Right, but you are the instrument of God.
Do the right thing.
You are
the right thing.
Yeah. Bonjour,
Yeah,
monsieur.
right. But I think,
bonjour.
I think that this is it, right? A lot of people who believe, they believe, but they almost feel as if they're not getting their money's worth. I don't know how a better way of explaining it, but that's the wrong way of looking at it. If your belief is based off of some form of reciprocity in this world, it's not going to happen. And it's not to say that it's not going to happen. Like, it's not to say that none of us are going to, like, we're all going to suffer, and then through suffering we're going to find salvation. That's not it. We can all live a good life. There's nothing saying that we can't.
Yeah. You. Something is happening in my mind, and I will say a lot of people, they reject God because they do good and they don't receive good. That's immature, you know. That's what I mean. If you do good, don't expect to have good in return. It's not true.
Well, it's also the measurement of good.
Right.
What is their definition of the good that they receive?
Yeah.
They think it's a material good rather than a spiritual good.
Well, I mean, that's why we are in the kind of very strange situation nowadays.
I think it's also a reflection now of more money and power. Right now, I'm just having the thought, I have a guitar sitting right in front of me. How lucky am I if I go into a very small and simple thing, how lucky am I that I sing? And right here, I have the luxury of having a guitar and a spouse who taught himself guitar so that he could help make me sing. And that not only does he make me sing by playing the guitar, that he actually loves it and expresses that he loves it when I sing. That it makes him feel wonderful when I sing. And if we looked at more of a microscopic things like that in our life, how wonderful are those things that I have in my life now? Just that small thing is very rich. But if I go to a bigger thing, well, I want to have a house, and I don't have a house, and I want to have the safety of something monetary in a bigger aspect, well, then I'm missing the point.
Yeah.
And I think it's also, I think, like, you know, sometimes you'll hear these arguments that, like, oh, you know, you do a good deed only because it makes you feel good. As if doing a good deed is like, as if feeling good for doing a good deed is somehow selfish. And like, I would just argue it's natural. Like there's like a natural quality in human beings that we want to do good. We define it in different ways. We define why it is that we want to do good, but we just do. It's something that was kind of ingrained into us. You know, I would say it's God, but
born
you know,
in the image of God. It's right there. Mm-hmm. It's so simple. It's actually almost so simple that people hate the simplicity of it.
Well, oui. Right.
But you have to think, like Augustine had to write a 1,000-page book, you know, to try to get this point across. Like exactly what you just said, right? As simple as it is, he had to write a 1,000-page book to get that point across to his contemporaries.
What was his audience?
What's the book?
No, what was his audience?
That's hard to say.
Intended audience.
His intended audience? Probably the church, whatever the church was at the time.
Yeah, I think that Augustine was certainly writing to intervene on the multitude of pagan sects that had infiltrated the church at that period of the collapse of Rome. And so
Right.
he was really working hard at diagnosing different types of cults that had masqueraded as Christianity with false ideologies into the church that he was trying to remedy.
Especially in North Africa and close to Egypt. There's a lot of sect at that time.
Yeah, like the Gnostics and the Manichaeans and the Gnostics came out of.
And then I heard someone, he said that there was a priest, he resurrect in Egypt at 200 or 400 after Christ. Anyways, there's a lot of sect at that time in North Africa.
And what's so interesting,
in Egypt.
What's so interesting even about our conversation is that we naturally kind of bring this down to the individual, right? We bring it down to the you and I and our experiences and what makes us happy, what makes us feel meaning. And I think that part of, and again, like there's so many quotes that I could have taken from, and I did mention it. I did think one of the quotes kind of mentioned it, that they're what Christianity tries to do, or what the Judeo-Christian Muslim tradition, let's say, tries to do, is tries to take the thing that is the multiplicity, the thing that is the biggest and greatest form of the universe, and bring it back to the individual, right? Because in any political activity, in any political action, it does come down to the individuals, right? Whether it's a government, a school, a household, right? Just want to break it down to the smallest, what's it called? Unit of people, right? A family household is still made up of individuals, and each individual's responsibility to honor and to respect that unit, and to allow for that unit to prosper and to grow and to develop, not just financially. I'm sure there are plenty of examples of families with wealth who are completely spiritually deprived, right? So there's I think what was so interesting and what made this kind of very difficult is that Augustine by no means is trying to argue against worldly wealth, or like having means, right? So I don't think he was arguing that Rome had all these Romes and then therefore that's what made it immoral. It's that Rome had these roads and they're good, but they were already morally degenerated, right? So the roads were almost like putting a Band-Aid on a scar, on a huge gash.
Unfortunately, I have to say goodbye. I have to go and return to kindergarten. I hope someday to bear the baby of Monsieur Matthew.
Did you know I'm pregnant?
You are pregnant, Matthew?
Does it show? Damn. All right, see you, Patrick. I'll catch you next Sunday, I hope.
Okay, yeah. The Sunday, I think I'm going to confirm if we can return to the course, but I'm sure at 95% sure we're going to the course Saturday.
Okay, Assad and I will be there.
Okay, so I call you back. Okay, see you all together.
Okay, good.
Ciao, Patrick.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Patrick.
Guys, I'm just going to leave you 2 seconds. I'll be right back.
Yeah, sure. Wow. Yeah, there's a Werner Heisenberg quote floating around as a meme right now that I've seen from a few sources that I really enjoyed, touching on some of what we just discussed. But Heisenberg, in this quote, he says something, I'm paraphrasing, to the effect that when you go into science, you are often led down to the path of atheism, but as you keep on digging at a certain point in life, you discover that ultimately God exists and is everywhere.
Yeah.
And I've heard a lot of scientists, I mean, he said that late in his life, and he went through the Copenhagen interpretation of science that denied truth, that said, you can't know what a particle is because as soon as you look at it, it moves it, so you don't know. So thus, truth doesn't exist. So he went through that path, and then later on, he returned to Plato and Timaeus, and he wrote about how in reading Plato, he discovered his method was all false because he was thinking statistically and not thinking about his own mind thinking about the universe, which it's a part of, right? So of course the act of looking at a light particle would change the particle, because we're also you can't separate the objective experimenter from the subjective experiment that he's looking at and trying to investigate, because he's part of it, or as part of creation. So yeah, it's definitely something which, even if you look at the beauty of a planet, the sphere of Jupiter, the beauty of the harmonies of a galaxy and these beautiful golden ratio spirals of galaxies, or you look down into the small snowflake and the microcosm of the atomic domain, and these beautiful geometric proportions that occur even on the microcosm. If you look for it, you find it, that there is a beauty, which has to come from somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm. Can I offer comment? Can you hear me?
Yeah, Michael.
Hi. I was having a bunch of technical issues and I was afraid to chime in, but I'm hoping you can hear me okay. I was just wanting to say a couple of words, just because there's a couple of things in here that resonated. In fact, Matthew, what you just said there too, that there are markers out there. If you used the analogy of snowflake or whatever, all kinds of physical manifestations out there that can represent a higher power architecture. And I would submit too, I think Patrick said this, that we're inclined to just go on blind faith. But as we're all here looking for more truth and wisdom, the fact is that if you're looking for that, you will find it. And some of the things that we would have at our disposal were not there in history. So the likes of Saint Augustine used what was at his disposal. Now we have internet tools and books and all kinds of things and the reflections of history that they didn't possess at that time. So now we can look and we have a full Bible in front of us. I don't know what was there at Saint Augustine's time or what he had access to. If you look at the Bible very closely, and if you read it and know what you're looking for or have an idea before you start, you will recognize the truth in it. And I will give you an example, just one that recently came up for me. In describing the Table of Nations, it is described in there as God has put it down, or the inspired works are there to detail all of the line from Adam down through Moses and then down through all the generations to Jesus. It also supplies the number of years that each were alive. And one would think that this is just, minuscule, I guess filler, if you were not inclined to believe that it had some merit. And for me now, my interpretation of this, as I've become aware of some other matters, is really incredibly important because, as some of you may be aware, there is an entity in the Bible that they refer to as Nephilim. And when you consider that the lengths that the inspiration of those works are detailing there, is actually showing you the difference between the true line from Adam all the way down through those ages and separating out those that are Nephilim based. So i.e. those that are evil or those that come from the Cain line. So there's the Seth line and the Cain line. So in my opinion on the Bible is just one. If you want to look for it, you will find it. You'll find amazing things in there if you really want to look and study what's there. So there are markers in the Bible, and there are markers outside the Bible, because even the Bible is not complete. Outside of that, I would say that there's also powers that will try and confuse you. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you believe in God and you were to take the opposite of that, then you would believe in a evil power, Satan, Lucifer, the devil, whatever you want to call it. The devil is there to confuse, as in Babylon, and therefore most people succumb to the pressures or the surroundings and take that bit of confusion and use it as reason to question faith. But if you really want to look and you're inclined to study and look for the markers analytically, they are all there and they all add up perfectly.
Just sorry, Michael. Aaron, you still can't hear anything, eh? Aaron's phone had died, and when he plugged it back in, all of a sudden his sound stopped working. So we're just trying to troubleshoot that quickly. I'm very sorry, guys. Yeah, so Aaron is saying he's still working at figuring it out. Yeah, no, I think
I feel like asking a question.
Yeah, sure.
For the hell of it, since we're also, what does it matter what line comes from what, Michael? Like, in terms of the different lines, hereditary, or like in what sense is this important? Like, if we were talking about the nature of the human mind and what this means, and the relationship to a creative being, what difference do these kind of lines and family lines or whatever, how does that change anything? Make it more or less true?
That's a very grand question. I don't want to go into where that ends up leading to, because that's another subject, but I think it's really important. And if you were to study the subject, you would come to the answer of why that's relevant. And so for that reason, I'm saying it's there. And so there's a lot of markers that are out there, and you have to mine that data and those readings on your own. And in your search for truth, you would then come across the reason for that. And that is important because it will ultimately play into the distortion of truth. And so from that perspective, I think it's important.
I would just say one thing, sort of keeping on the track of the discourse that Aaron had developed and what you've just contributed to. I know for myself, like if you, I remember when I was younger, I was told to, I received a phone call asking if we had milk in the fridge, and I was sure that there was no milk, and I opened up the fridge door and couldn't see milk, and I said, yeah, no, buy milk. So when my mother came home, I was, maybe like 15 years old, she opened the fridge door. I was like, there's already 2 bottles of milk in there. I was like, what? And I looked, and sure enough, there was 2 bottles of milk. But in my mind, I was so firm in my convictions that there was no milk that my eyes couldn't see, honestly, that there was no milk in that fridge. So we had 3 bottles of milk. I was thinking about, how oftentimes people will read whatever religious writing that they have access to, and they have a lot of prejudices going into it, and they'll just read those parts of their religious book that reinforce their prejudices and just disregard whole chunks of it that fall off that are not that don't reinforce, right? So if you look at whether that's Plato or whether that's the Bible or the Quran or the Torah, whatever it is, if you're a good person and you're tuned to loving your fellow man and loving yourself and doing good, if that's something you're wired to, then you will find all of those things inside of your Quran or Torah or Bible or whatever that will be something you feed off of, that reinforces that conviction you have. And if you are not, and you lack love in your heart, you will tend to zero in only on those things that tend to beef up your prejudices and ignorance towards your fellow man. And things like the Crusades, Eric brought that up earlier on in our discussion. I think every time the oligarchy is able to manipulate a war between religions, which they do all the time, it's always by that second path, right? Making sure that people only learn how to fear, how to have a relationship with their idea of their religion in a way that inflames their fear and ignorance of their neighbors, of other cultures or other faiths, rather than looking for the universal and the good.
Mm. Yeah, I would, if I may, I would apply that to the Confessions of Saint Augustine directly, in a kind of funny way, because when you look at this is like in the 4th century AD, and so there had been, without getting too historical, but there had been the Nicene Council, a few decades before his conversion, and then but the idea that a Manichaean can't be doing good, or that a Arian Christian can't be doing good, which is kind of similar to Islamic doctrine on God. is like the Arian doctrine on God, the single, one God, not a Trinity. Or between like Catholics and Orthodox interpretation of Augustine, like with the Philoquy or the, doctrine of original sin. In my heart and in my relations with people, these are kind of like less than tertiary concerns from the point of view of what brings people together, and really more on the the wavelength of what is good. And I'm sorry that I missed your earlier discourses on Plato and what is good, what is justice, but it really ties in, I think, to Saint Augustine's conception of grace and truth. But there's a lot of stuff that we don't have to saddle in with every piece of baggage. Like the gentleman Aaron, it's like for him, the dynamic of Jesus Christ is not even necessarily pertinent into understanding, the message of Saint Augustine. And I think that's very profound. And so the thing with Saint Augustine is that the way that people can interpret it can be very divisive, and can be like what Matt was saying, like how religion can be used to cause wars. Because like a lot of the split between like Russian Christianity and Roman Christianity is over actually the work of Saint Augustine, but not what Augustine said, but the way that it was interpreted centuries after he died. And that's going to happen, right? So here we are, like in the year 2020, and we're kind of like putting the pieces back together, kind of like what happened and why, so in direct to the gentleman that was, and to summarize about God, it's a term that people use. I think that, as Matt was saying, you can like get into the science, and the road of science actually leads you to the understanding of, you can ponder certain questions and arrive at certain discoveries. As the gentleman that was saying, who left to go to kindergarten, that when you look at the structure of the universe, that it's really impossible to not be held together by consciousness. I mean, if any of the rules of physics was just a fraction of a millionth decimal point over in any other direction, nothing would hold together. Yet here we are. So for me, that's very profound. And that's a direct scientific discovery that everyone can make and then arrive at that same truth. And that's how we know that it's true. But on a different level, something that I have just personally found, and it can be really embarrassing, it can be really embarrassing to do, but if you just open your heart and ask for a sign, you will find a sign. You will like your request for a sign of, whatever you want to call it, the great intelligence, God, energy, consciousness, whatever you want to call it. You ask for a sign and you will get it. We have to be open to the possibility, like Matt was saying about the refrigerator with the milk. It said that Native Americans in the Caribbean didn't even see the Spanish ships because they didn't have and there they were, the Spanish ships. They didn't even see them because it was like not on their radar screen of anything they would be expecting to see. Yet, I mean, they were physical material things right there. So if something like that can't be seen unless you're like prepared to see it, I would say definitely the scientific path is important because we're endowed with these faculties. We can think, so we should use that. But humility and asking for a sign I think would really blow anyone away who does it. I'm sure many people have. I'm not trying to presume that people haven't, but to anyone who has a question about that, those would be my final words on that. Ask for a sign, you'll get one.
I'm not sure what I'd missed up to this point. My phone died. But there's something about what you said at the end about like the scientific path. I've always, and we kind of went through it with some of the quotes today, is that like the path of discovering the laws of the physical universe is necessary and it's part of the human experience, and it's not something we should neglect. But I'm not sure that the scientific path, let's say, or the rational path, necessarily brings you to the answer of human happiness, right? Or of human meaning. That I think although I'm saying path as if they're separate paths, ultimately it's all the same thing, but it's when you're trying to figure out for yourself as an individual, what is the source of my happiness? What is the source of my meaning? Like ultimately we could find objective things, a career, a family, a good retirement. But I think this has been in my experience, and even through, you know, like if you look at Plato and if you look at Augustine, that ultimately that would still fall short of the ultimate experience of love and of happiness, which is in God. Again, I don't know exactly how does that manifest? You know, you said, if you ask, you shall receive. I mean, look, I've definitely asked for a lot of things in my life. Not that I haven't received them, but that I haven't received them in the way I thought I would, maybe in the way that I wanted to. You know, I think one of the things you don't ask for and you receive in plenty is lessons. I think that you're guaranteed in life
right.
that if you don't ask for anything, you are definitely going to get a lesson. You're going to be taught something.
Well, Aaron, I would suggest that that happiness is reality right now minus expectation. So you remove the expectation, or think about all the things going on in your life right now that 5 or 10 years ago you were like, man, if I just did this or had that or finished this, I would be happy. You know, whether it's like maybe a new apartment or whatever, refinance this or did this. Those are like the way that society kind of sets us up is to keep seeing that the grass is greener on the other side. So I'm getting a sign that my internet connection's unstable. So I will.
We can hear you just fine.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. You know, yeah, there are limits to science, but worse is the scientism. In the what we're seeing a lot in the culture, whether it's like Bill Nye the Science Guy or Neil Tyson deGrasse.
Yeah.
They're promoting, and I'm sure you're very knowledgeable on this, but just my view is that like they're promoting a very narrow, you know, definition of what science is. You know, what's that? What do they call the theory of knowledge? Epistemology, and this is like leading towards a very dark definition or pursuit of of being, right? Ontos, right? Ontology. So their epistemology is leading towards a very dark ontology, and I think it has turned people off to. I think that you can find if we mean by science the use of our cognitive faculties to reason through things, I think that we can arrive at a very strong scientific foundation for the belief in God or the discovery of God, and that alone should confer a tremendous amount of satisfaction and meaning. But I would say that happiness is a decision that we have to make. It's a decision that we have to make.
Yeah. So Aquinas actually explicitly makes these arguments against the trying to discover God. And so he makes this point that you can point at things and you can say, look, this is an example of the existence of God. But to ever look at something and say, this is God, I've discovered God, would be a mistake. Which I personally,
yes.
I'm in favor for it. And I think partly why I brought up what I brought up is that 100%, like when I mean like the path of science, I mean logic, reason, really investigating, not just taking something for granted. And so you could apply that to the journey of human happiness, right? I think of relationships as the best example, right? People go through many different types of relationships. I want to give people the benefit of the doubt and believe that every single time they did, it was for good intentions and good reasons, but that ultimately no matter what the reasons or the intentions might have been in those situations, that there was something beyond what you could see at the time, right? And you have to investigate that. And I think that this is where you see a difference between somebody who grows after a relationship and somebody who doesn't, is that somebody who grows says, look, I see where my shortcomings were, I see where their shortcomings were, I see where I made this mistake, that mistake, and I'm going to grow and learn from it. That's an investigative process. You had an hypothesis of the relationship, the hypothesis wasn't true, so you had to move on. Didn't mean that everything was wrong about the experiment, it just means that there were things that didn't fit into place. You know, and then you have on the other hand, people who get kind of like yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry, yeah. I wanted to hear what you were gonna say.
Well, I was just going to bring up the opposite example, is that, you know, then you have on the other hand people who start to become pessimistic and resentful and think that the world is out to get them, you know, as opposed to and I think you could apply that to science as well. You know, I think of Stephen Hawking as like, it's an unfortunate tragedy what this man had to live, but you can kind of see in his own ideologies of the universe and his own perspective of the universe is very pessimistic, bleak, and dark perspective.
That's a very good observation. And a number of his assessments have been like proven patently false, and he's had a very difficult time. There's the ego, right? Very difficult time just saying, yeah, I was wrong. He has to always like equivocate on like that black holes ain't so black and so forth. But they have with Thomas, like the scholastic, you know, the scholasticists, you know, Thomas Aquinas and the scholasticists is is really going out of its way to say that the subject of scientific truth is separate from the knowledge of God, because that's setting up, and that's going to set up the whole, you know, sciences that give rise to like the Renaissance and everything out of the you know, the scholasticists, right? So, but in our Eastern you know, tradition of Christianity, which is also called Catholic, Orthodox Catholicism, right? We don't have the Aquinas doctrine of scholasticism, but we think that, you know, knowledge is very good, but it can also lead to but it's not the same thing as faith, and it's not the same thing as humility. So, you know, it's so interesting what you were saying before at the beginning when I jumped on the call about the Augustine's city, Rome as the city, and one of the things that I would hope, you know, in our study of the subject is to like separate some of the politics of Rome, what they were doing at the time, the intrigues of greed and political position were always like tied up, even at the Vatican, even at in the early days, the pursuing of heretics, and that's not. I'm not criticizing, you know, the history of a religion for God's sake, but just that it's important not to conflate or to what I mean is this: sometimes the things that people wrote, you know, contained a lot of truth, but they had to also say things in there so that truth could be heard by people who wouldn't otherwise want to hear it. So he had to kind of couch arguments like a certain way that were more appealing to like Rome's physical, material, economic position in relationship to like barbarians and stuff like that. So there's like some art that has like Thomas Aquinas, and then there's like Rome surrounded by demons and the bad kind, and the demons are supposed to like symbolize barbarians, right? But a lot of those barbarians were already Christianized at this time, so it's even questionable how. I'm not even saying that non-Christians are even barbarians, but these are Christian barbarians that are you know, demons, right? So like I just mean that we have to like separate out it can be hard to do, and then like the gentleman's point, like no wonder so many people don't believe in God. Like think about like burnings at the stake, or, you know, inquisitions, and or what the Catholic Church, and I don't mean the Catholic Church, but what Christians, people, individuals did, not even the institution, but what Christian people did with Native Americans. You know, I am one. So, but yet we can still find the beauty and the truth in that. And I think that is the triumph of the human spirit right there. That's the real point. It's not that we throw those things out, but that is despite all of that.
Yeah. And I think we're lucky. Historically, we're kind of positioned. I didn't really mention this too much. I should have. It was in my notes. But another one of the fundamental arguments that Augustine is making against Rome is that Rome was never founded with true principles of justice. And so that ultimately, because it didn't have founded in its constitutions these ideas of justice, that it was bound to break that bond, whatever that bond meant at the time. And I think today, you know, I think of the United States in particular, because it is a place that faces a lot of criticism, and I think it's a place that has failed many times at following through with the promise that it made. But yet, the foundation, right, the ideas, the principles are beautiful, and they're good, and they're just. And the issue I think we have today, right, because we can look at Augustine, that's 2,000 years ago, it's the fall of Rome, whatever. But we're living in an empire right now. Canada is part of an empire. The United States is part of an empire. And we've been very successful building up the city, the earthly city. We have, you know, for the most part, maybe it's failing, I don't know. But we for the most part, successfully built up the earthly city. But the question is that have we degenerated spiritually? Has our society forgotten the promise that it made to itself, not to anybody else, right? That was what the promise the founding forefathers made, is that we hold these truths to be self-evident, and that we're going to found a nation off of these truths, and that ultimately was up to us to take up the challenge in our own lives. You know, and I think my own frustration sometimes when I look at the political dialogues that we have today is that there's a lot of this kind of politicized team mentality. And it almost reminds me of like the Christians versus the pagans in the Roman Empire, where, you know, you're the enemy, you're the one who's the reason why this is happening. And then on the other side, no, you're the reason why this is happening. And I think what Augustine did beautifully in this work, and even if you've read his Confessions, there is this sense that he as an individual is very well aware of his own life and the life that he lived, and that even though there is a righteous path, he wasn't always on it, but there's a way to get on it as individuals. And that rather than looking for different monsters in the world to blame and to fight against, we should look at the monsters within ourselves, and we should fight those monsters. And that's why I think like fundamentally, whatever your spiritual belief or religious belief may be, I think if your belief system doesn't ultimately come back to yourself and how you perceive yourself, in the sense of not perceive yourself in an arbitrary sense, but perceive yourselves in the eyes of justice and truth, then I think you might be following you know, something that is either deceitful or misinformed. You know, so you brought up the question, like, are non-Christians demons? I mean, I don't think so. I believe not. But maybe there's something about their belief system that is leading them down a path that is detrimental to their own spiritual existence.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm just shooting at it.
All right, so metaphorically, the imagery of demon or whatever kind of ugly imagery that we see in these old paintings, it could be perceived or interpreted as something, yeah, like more, as you said, a process of detrimental outcome by virtue of following a false path, and not like a literal, this is evil embodied incarnate or something.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in on here?
Please.
Like it just brings to mind that what you're talking about is basically the cause of that is the separation of the state and the church. And you have that, like, you know, nations very much, they act like individuals, and in the same as an individual, if you separate your senses and your morals, you will eventually end up sacrificing one or the other, which will either lead you to, you know, bestial ways or barbaric ways. And the same will happen with a nation. If you try and separate the state and the church, if you try and separate theology from the things that physically need to be done, you will end up sacrificing one or the other, and you will essentially fall into the trap of what we are in today, where the United States is trying to bring itself back to that Christian tradition which the Constitution is founded upon.
Mm-hmm.
But to reunite those forces is an incredibly difficult thing to do in an individual, let alone in a nation. And the US is the closest to it in world history.
Can I just say, a main part is because they took religion out of the school systems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the same's happened in Britain, and it's happened all over Europe, which has led to the individual doing the same to itself. So people today, they, of course, everyone's born in this image of God. They have morality, they have virtue, but they separate it from their senses. They say, yeah, whatever, I'll do it this one time, and it'll be okay. It doesn't matter. And the nations do the same thing. They practice, they go to church. Mike Pence goes to church, no doubt. All the neocons, they go to church, and then the very next moment, they start a war on an innocent country in the Middle East. Talk about sacrificing your principles the very moment you just stepped out of the doors of theology. I mean, and that's how it's done. Like, the individual manages to somehow sacrifice one or the other for not a higher degree of action, a lower degree.
What I find even worse is that they accept now euthanasia and killing of the old people and having abortions up to the 10th month.
Exactly. And it's deriving from the same thing. The
it's
action
the same, yeah.
is not led by theological values, by principles. So they can somehow separate in their mind, like, oh, there's a compromise there. There's a pragmatism, which is in and of itself evil, because they sacrifice the very highest principles for the sake of the part. And you can't. You cannot sacrifice the parts for the whole.
No.
Can I push back maybe just slightly a little bit? I'm not like, I think how I would frame what you're saying slightly differently is that I'm very skeptical or cautious of the idea of religion needing to somehow be reintroduced into political society. However, I think maybe what you're saying is the spirit, right? The spirit of those traditions, the spirit of those belief systems.
Yeah, call it what you want. It's faith.
Yeah, like I would even go further to say that, like, it's almost the spirit. I don't know how this is gonna sound, but it's almost the spirit in how we lead certain things that matters more than how we actually implement it in doctrine, right? So once we start to put things down into doctrine, we make things law, right? We have to face the consequences of those things. I think abortion is a great example. I'm not for abortion. I think it's an immoral thing to do. But I think in law, in a state where a government entity isn't necessarily involved in the inner workings of every individual person, right? What needs to be there is the spirit of justice. So we as a society should recognize, and it should be an open conversation that we should have as a society to say, look, this is an immoral action. But there are cases where it's justified. And there are cases where we as a society should create laws where it can be justified. Yeah. I think today we've gone to an extreme, right? Today we've definitely 100% gone to extreme, because I think it's not that religion is missing, it's just the spirit is missing. The fundamental thing that unifies human beings is missing.
Yeah. I think Joaquin has a thought he wants to contribute.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, this is connecting together what Nick was saying and Birgit was saying, and Aaron. So I would like, like sometimes you have smaller communities that you have like the democratic process at the city council or at the school board. And the thing is that you might have 99 or 100% or 99.999% of a single denomination in a certain school district. And it seems that like some of the federal mandates, at least in the United States, Title V and things like this, discrimination laws, have made it impossible for more local school districts to introduce things like religion in the school that is reflective of the community. So it's a different question like in major cities, like I'm from Los Angeles, I have friends in New York, and that would never work, right? Because we have like Buddhists and Hindus and like, you know, Scientologists even, right? So that's just, so like a specific prayer type is not going to work. But there's so many, but like 45% of Americans don't live in big cities, and their towns are relatively homogeneous, like the same type of faith or same. So it could really work there. But the thing,
I sorry to interrupt you. I really didn't think of introducing one specific religion, but every child in the United States said before they started in the morning, they said a prayer, the truth and this kind of a stuff. This fit for everybody. It's just like a moral anchoring a person into being a good person. And doing good for the country and for your friends and neighbors and for everybody.
Well, it sounds like you're talking about a political humanism, right? Like,
yeah, but they had like a prayer in the United States everywhere, and it was just it fit for everybody, anybody.
Yeah.
Well, like one of the negative consequences of the way that the federal influence in local education is that it's polarized the debate about public education, and it's turned people off of public education because of these types of cultural wedge issues, like, you know, wedge issues, right? So like, and it's almost like it's a plot, right, from oligarchs in a way, to make things to like, why doesn't the federal government mandate that schools have all the money they need? No, because they could print the money. We know that, right? But instead they make a mandate that's going to make people say, oh, we need to have private schools if we need religion in schools, or we need to have charter schools if we need religion in schools. And charter schools can be fine. But the point is that it's undermined people's confidence in government when government does things that are unpopular, like at the local level, right? And it's confused people about what federalism is and how much, and so it's turning people into confederalists when federalism had all the stuff they really, you know, wanted and needed if it was done like the right way. So this is like an American conversation on that, but yeah, I definitely understand what you mean, Birgit. Thank you for that, for clarifying that. I think that the way that eliminating that dimension of the human experience, which is represented in religion, like what Aaron was saying, like the essence of it, yeah, it's totally like, you know, look at the consequences that it's had on our communities, right? Yeah. So yeah.
How mean people have become now towards their neighbors, and if you think different, there's no more respect, and this has not been instilled in the young people.
But you know, I think like a part of where my hesitation comes from is that I'm always very cautious of like putting things in writing or like making something a law, you know, and that's why I think I focused on the idea of on the spirit of something, because I think more than anything right now we have fairly good laws, and I think it's good that church and state is separate. I don't think that the church should be involved with political affairs, but I think that our leaders need to have a spirit. They need to have a faith, right? And I don't think it's something that we should make as a doctrinal thing, but it is part of society. Like, I think the idea that like America is not a Christian state is a very new thing. I think for the most part, the United States is a Christian state. Most people there are Christians. It's something that I think is a product of after the 60s to try to liberalize the country.
You can recognize it because you have all those Christian churches everywhere.
Well, forget the churches. It's the people, right?
Yeah, this is like an expression of.
We can't forget the churches. They're the ones that teach the principles.
Wow.
But that it's not
inside Montreal. It's going to be.
I just meant like I'm not about a physical monument to Christianity. I mean, there's a spirit in the nation.
Yeah. But it's come from somewhere.
Sure, no, that's
it's come from a human being. Like, it's been handed down from God to us, and we have to teach it. And there has to be a place, there has to be a form where one can teach this. I can honestly testify that in schools today there are no religious studies. like whatsoever. And you can practice, like, doesn't have to be any particular religion, but there needs to be some form of morality.
Yeah.
Education. So call it what you want, but it's the base.
Pascal, Pascal, being a high school teacher right now, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that point, teaching in a Native American community as you do.
Yeah, well, I had different thoughts in my mind right now. Well, for a couple of minutes, I was wondering if I, when to intervene, but this is just a very interesting discussion. I'm more on the side of what Aaron was saying. I'm kind of scared of putting religion, but I think we made the point that it's not exactly what we want when we say religion and state together. It's more the spirit and the embodiment, actually, the embodiment, not just the spirit, but the embodiment of principles, which are connected to the research of what is good and what is true, which I think is, maybe the humanistic way of putting it, but that's what religion should be. So I was just thinking also that there were times in history where there were different, like in Al-Andalus, maybe I don't remember who worked on that, but in Al-Andalus, that's Spain, a long time ago, when the Muslim actually had conquered and organized Spain at the time. And you had actually very interesting systems of, there was a certain concord between the Muslims, the Christians, and the Jews. They were segregated in terms of, different parties of towns, where, in the cities, there was the Muslim part, the Jewish part, and the Christian part. But it was a kind of interesting idea at the time, which I don't advocate for today, but at the time, the idea was that, if you were to commit a crime, well, if you were a Muslim, you would be tried before a Muslim judge, a Muslim jury, or whatever type of tribunal existed at the time, and so on and so forth. If you were a Christian, the same thing would apply to you, but you would be seen by a Christian, by a priest or a Christian authority, and so I don't think that would work today. But the whole discussion that just occurred, it made me think of that and how it used to work in certain places at a certain moment in time in our history, and that's something that I think we should remember, and that could maybe provide interesting insight into how we can lead things in the future. But it's interesting you asked me the question, Matt, because here I'm in a Inuit community, and people are very religious. They are very religious in a kind of blind mode. Or they're either very religious or very anti-religion for reasons that you probably know.
Yeah.
But religion was forced onto them to a certain extent by the Anglicans, by the British, through the East India Company outpost, what here was called the Hudson Bay Company. And so they became Anglican to a certain extent. And yeah, it's a very interesting way. There's a bit of syncretism with what used to be the thinking of the Inuit people before. But yeah, it's mainly some kind of Catholicism, but the English brand. They're always very surprised when I tell them that their Pope is the Queen of England. I really like to tell them that.
Did you
no,
talk
it's
about the mustache on the queen?
Well, no, but I basically make it clear that, you know, what the British Empire has been doing is you know, Hitler to the power of 10. But it's kind of hard to have real theological or, you know, discussion about religion, because they still have, at least in my community, which is peculiar to this community, it's not like that everywhere in the northern Quebec, in all the Inuit communities, but in my community there's still religious classes. So up until you're in secondary 5, you still have religious courses that you have to pass to get your degree. But this, I've discussed that with the kids here, and you know, like we had this back and forth about reason and faith. Some, you know, a lot of good people in the community, they have faith and they don't really question it, and they try to live a good life. But when things are said for, you know, just, you know, are just said because, well, that's how it is, that's how it should be, or, you know, whatever, it's how it used to be. You know, a lot more are questioning it and are not finding any reason to believe or to go by these principles. So a lot of youths right now are going, I don't know if, you know, they're turning really atheistic, but they are clearly displeased by whatever happened to them, and, you know, by looking at the culture before the European entered, you know, in their world, and after, and, you know, what was brought to them by the exchanges. They become very you know, I don't know, disappointed, depressed about the situation right now. But there's few students that I have that we, you know, with whom I started to have discussions about different things, like, you know, I think you talked about Leibniz at the beginning before the presentation. Like, I'm trying to introduce them to Leibniz, which I think is a very, very interesting character in our universal history. And because I know, since, you know, they understand to a certain extent, they're kind of funny with that. They understand to a certain extent that they're kind of Chinese in their roots, or, you know, Mongolians, or, you know, Northern Asian types. they like to laugh about that they were Chinese one day, and now that, well, it's been a long time, but they still look a little bit like the Asian type. So I tried to bring them Leibniz, and try to bring them what Leibniz actually said about the Chinese Confucian you know, philosophy, and Christianity, and how, you know, there's something to be found that's universal to all people, and that's what we should focus on. So I don't want to take too much time, but that's usually what I discuss with my students. I try to see, you know, how if they can fare well with this idea, and if so, then, you know, we can go a bit more in depth. Otherwise, well, I leave it to them.
I think that's a really good point you made, Pascal, and that brings it back to the point of, like, what Joaquin was saying about the power of an appropriate approach to science, because it gives you a pathway without all this baggage to a discovery, which everybody can hold in their mind, which science is a pathway to a moral discovery. It's not just, you know, a kind of dead discovery in a petri dish or something like that. And to be led on a path like Leibniz was a Christian, but was able to identify with, you know, what the Chinese culture also had a capability with just their history of discoveries already at that point, that their minds were actually in tune with what were the positive aspects of technological scientific progress of the Christian civilization. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's great that we have all of these backgrounds in religion. I was raised, my mom is a Chinese and she's a Buddhist. And so I was never really, I went a little bit to Sunday school, but I was never really raised in a religious manner. And I think that, you know, all of us coming here together, it's really because we had a discovery of what our minds were able to connect with in terms of this concept of universal history, universal truth. And so religion can be a pathway to that, but I think for the future, especially with like these dialogue of civilizations becoming, you know, really, it's gonna, for us to really have like a future with peace and cooperation and trust, this like whole East and West divide, which has a lot of cultural barriers, it really has to come to a point where we go more and more into a way of just speaking from a universal standpoint. So we can bring in like, well, my background is whatever it is, but it's ultimately to that common ground of like how the mind really comes to a discovery that is a real discovery is always going to be linked with morality, with beauty, with love. And so science from that standpoint, which is not something we've really been taught in society, is really, really powerful, I think. Like the idea of going into space, like a lot of people think like, who cares? But actually going into space, what the Russians and the Chinese are doing, that it's, if you really understand what it is, it's really a powerful thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a question because I'm a little bit confused. I must say, like we've spent our whole conference doing Saint Augustine, but from what Christine was just saying, how do we expect then to bring people to exercise morality in each and every industry if there's no cohesion between theology and statehood?
Well, maybe if I can just respond in part, I think that the accessibility of this conversation to each of us comes from the fact that we're peers and that we're friends. So there's a familiarity that we've all developed with each other, which allows for this conversation to flourish and to grow. And I think in addition to that, what Christine said is that we've all already made a certain discovery in our own lives. So this is a mature conversation, a conversation that isn't coming from just strictly a belief system. And I think, like, we can't reject that the foundation of our morality is Judeo-Christian. The foundation of our morality is from the Church of Europe. But that kind of in part of what Christine was saying is that moving forward, it's not to neglect that past or disregard that past, but to see that past in common with other, I don't want to say perspectives or belief systems, but other cultures and other groups who have found that path, who have found that truth from a different path. I don't know if that made as much sense as it did in my head.
Yeah, I would like to add something on that vein, if possible. If we see God or the ultimate truth or being as the summit of a mountain, there are different paths to go to that summit of the mountain. And if we read the Republic of Plato about justice, or we read about Confucius, or we read about Saint Augustine, or even the tantric perspective on the human development, maybe the words and the vocabulary are different, but I think that we go through more or less the same station in the development of the human mind.
Joaquin, yeah, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to Nick's very good question, because he's presenting like a very honest and important dilemma of, it appears like a or you know, cautionary question. I think is a very good one. So I can only speak from like a perspective of that in Eastern Orthodoxy, when they dealt with the question of church and state, there is, and I think that also the Holy See in the Vatican, pre-Vatican II, is of this mind, and also any like Lutheran or Protestant denomination as well, that you don't want like a theocracy, right? Like, in other words, a specific denomination is the law of the land, right? There's a practical reason that even defends that main religion. You know, governments are prone to corruption, even if they're set forth upon very good ideals. And it's very important to not contaminate like the church with the corruption of the material, of the worldly, you know, the secular, the intrigues and the plots and stuff. And I think also that as Aaron was saying, and as Cynthia was saying as well, who I've just met right now. So I just like literally just met right now. This is not like we talked about this beforehand. Is that you know, you want to bring as many people on board with this as possible. And so the more specific that you make the basic, like the more alienating the language that's used, right, is going to have like the opposite from intended effect, right? Because then it's going to be like, you know, is it the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, or is it the Father that proceed? Is it the Father that proceed? Is the Son proceed from the Father, and then is the Holy Ghost a separate entity? I mean, you know. But I think the real question is like, what is good, right? Like, so what is justice? What is truth? So even though we can arrive at these, I think the same truth as Kwan just said, it's like the mountaintop, different paths. I would consider it like a matter of high offense personally if someone told me like, well, you have to drop what you think, or you can't teach your children what you think, or you can't have a community based in these more specific things. But we're facing a global crisis where we could have a global scamdemic or intercontinental nuclear warfare, right? So we have to be able to have like a foundation of dialogue with a shared vision of truth that isn't as specific as we have the right to be, like as we all have the right to be as specific. But then when we kind of come into the stage of not getting into a crisis situation, like where nuclear missiles get lobbed at each other, or where we start using biological warfare to keep people inside, right? That's where we get to how can we sort of distill like the detailed stuff into things which are the most inclusive as possible, and without going down like some politically correct, you know, path, without what's the word? Getting rid of its teeth, right?
Principle, or
yeah, without declawing it, right? Like, I mean, the power of faith and the power of let's say of God is what you want to distill, right? You don't want to like have the lowest common denominator be the things which are the worst aspects of what we all are, like consumerists and materialists and selfish individuals, which is kind of like how the global oligarchs have, you know, built their system, I think. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a commonality, right? So that's how I would frame it.
I'm not talking about the commonality. I understand that there's commonality between all religions. I'm talking about the separation of faith and the state. Like very specifically, like how would we achieve those goals by separating morality from what we conduct in political and industrial affairs?
Oh, do you mean like a specific faith, like Lutheran, or do you mean like
definitely not Lutheran, but like any faith that like one wishes to practice?
Yeah.
Like in the US, it's stated that all people like the freedom to practice all religions, regardless.
Right.
It's really beautiful, but my point is like faith is a universal thing, not specific faith, not singulars, universal faith. How would separating that from the daily lives of the individuals of the state achieve these goals that we're talking about?
Nick, where did your faith start?
Well, kind of a divine intervention. I was an atheist for a long time, and I was really struggling with some dark demons such as jealousy, vanity. Yeah, I'll leave it there. That's enough. And I was on my knees, banging my head against the floor, begging for mercy. And to be totally honest with you, life changed.
Yeah.
I cannot explain to you absolutely how, but I've been blessed, and I have never been baptized or christened. I've rarely even walked into a church, but I have a large amount of faith.
But I think like your answer is like the root of the problem, because faith comes to us in many different ways, right? And faith is something that can't necessarily be taught, like it's a difficult answer to a complex question. Right?
Yeah, I know. And I know that I was taught religious studies in school.
That's why it's a good question.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. It's a great question. It's a greght question.
I really do think it's essential. I think when we look at individuals just in general, in power, in sport, in celebrity, in fame, whatever you derive an individual, there's this lack of morality. And if you go into the poor world, the developing world, so to speak, which I can testify I have, there's this morality, and they don't have the knowledge we have, but there's this love. There's this love, and it doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what race you have. It's just something which is moral, and I think it's so much more profound to lead a life like this, even minus the knowledge, because they're happy. And you could throw on top of that, as much knowledge as you want, and those people will make the right decision.
Yeah.
They will make just and honest conclusions.
Yes, but Nick, I would like to give an objection to that. I think that you need to go through the temptation of wealth to be truly moral. Because
Are you saying you have to have sin to know what sin is?
Juan,
I don't perceive
we're losing
Juan. Wealth.
Okay, Juan, oh boy. We sort of lost your connection a little bit. So, your question is great. I think everybody was able to hear your core question at the beginning.
I didn't hear it. I didn't understand it, what he said.
Ask him also to type it.
Okay, you could also type your thought if you want, but the core question that I think was of high value, that I'm going to ask you to repeat some of what you said, and hopefully it works, was that was it not necessary to come to faith through, could somebody please reword it?
To really test one's morality, you have to be adorned with wealth.
Do you have to have your morality tested in order to become a person of faith? Is that necessary in the process or not?
Sin to know the sinner.
Was Juan? We're losing you again, man. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, his connection is very bad.
Yeah. Okay.
Ask him to type it.
Jim Carrey said the same thing not long ago, actually. He said that he wants everyone, he wished that everyone had the opportunity to find wealth and fame and do all the things they ever wanted to do, so that they could figure out for themselves that that's not the answer.
Yeah. Well, that's not the ultimate answer. It's part of human development, but it's not the final station. I like the word station, like in metro station.
Well, I guess, can I just say one little thought on that? In a healthy education system, which is geared not towards memorization so much, which ours is very much tied to getting the right answers on a test, right? Memorizing the right formulas.
He also denies truth. Our education
Christine
denies
also, yeah, that's what I'm getting at. And if you have such an education system that just puts your mind into such bad habits, you don't go through the process of discovery, of like really discovering, why does the Pythagorean theorem work? What is the qualitative nature of number? It's not just the formula you're memorizing, but really what's the quality of physical action that your mind has to take in hypothesizing the solution to a problem concept. What's that?
I'm sorry. I think that's.
Aaron, I can't hear you. Aaron? Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. I don't know what's going on. My phone is glitching. Just
Okay.
continue.
So just to finish my thought, yeah, when I know for every single real discovery I could say that I've made is knowledge, which came through an act of sort of like a bit of pain, struggle. I never had the right answer right away. Not like the high school textbook where I was given the formula and told to like work out mathematical proofs, memorize and reproduce, but rather like a real discovery is I never had the right answer. I always had to work and get negative solutions before I could stumble on the right positive solution. So there's a certain amount of negation I had to go through to formulate a healthy, like I had to know what I didn't know and become really aware of what I didn't know before I could say, okay, now I'm free to discover something new as a positive knowledge, which was much rarer and harder to do, but it had to go through that fire. For morality, I don't know. I mean, if the question does come up, I forget who said that. Does that mean, if I extend that to moral discoveries, do you have to commit every vice in order to discover that vice is wrong? Is that an extrapolation I would want to make, or is there a danger there?
No, but it depends at which station. It depends at which station you are.
Go on. What do you mean?
It depends at which station you are. Okay, do you remember in the dialogue of the Republic by Plato at the end, when the guy discover if he goes inside the platform where the team would move on the platform.
Juan, I'm so sorry, Juan. You're a brilliant mind, and I know that you have a lot to contribute to this conversation.
Yeah.
But the connection is not on your side, man.
I will try to write it.
Yeah, do that. And next week, when we do the next week lecture, find a different part of your house, which might have a better
maybe. Yeah. Maybe.
But yeah, write it out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the agreement of what Matt said.
Yeah.
That you don't necessarily need to commit every vice to understand what morality is. Morality can be taught, created in the image of God. Therefore, we must be capable of learning it before we commit it.
But they say you learn through mistakes, you know. And
that's a cliche. I mean, it's not entirely a cliche, but you know, there's some truth in that. Of course, there is, because as Matt said, you need to go through forms of negation.
Yes.
We're talking about morality. It's something metaphysical. It's actually,
Well, I would also put forward
intuitive.
That, you know, to discover morality, you have to discover something that's beyond your own individual existence. You have to understand something that you're a part of, which is such a large whole that is, you know, reaching for perfection, or has the potential of perfection, so a form of perfection. And so obviously we cannot experience that. And thus our minds already from that standpoint have an ability to learn that is through what you could call a thought experiment. So education is very useful in that sense of that you can teach, like, children from a very young age are capable of doing thought experiments. So, I mean, of course, you can learn from your mistakes in life, and as I think Aaron was saying, like, if you ask for something, whether you like it or not, you're going to get a lesson, and these are the life lessons. But our mind is also capable of doing thought experiments, which is a very powerful thing. And part of that is where solutions come from. A solution to a problem that, like, we're at a point now in the world where we have problems that we've never faced in the level of complexity that we've ever had in history. So we have to exit our present way of thinking. And the solution to that is obviously through these thought experiments that are based on the principles of truth.
Yeah. And, you know, I wanted to add to your point of, like, educating from a young age. And I think part of why I was asking you, Nick, of where you found your faith, I think where I was having some difficulty in the terms of, like, educating, or re-educating theology back into society is that, as far as I'm aware, where faith is really taught is at home with your family, whether it's taught, you know, positively or negatively, like whether or not you get it from, but I think it's at home, your relationship with your parents, your relationship with your siblings and your grandparents, that I think in a lot of ways informs how you enter into the world and what your bias is. And then you go to the world and you make these mistakes and so on and so forth. And then there's a whole other process. But I think fundamentally at the foundation, right, if we're talking about how do we get the spirit back into society, and I think this is maybe why I'm kind of reluctant to it, because I already feel like it is there. I think where the spirit isn't is in the leadership, right? On the highest levels of society, that spirit isn't there. But I think, at least I have this sense that on the lower levels of society, people still have faith. And yeah, sure, not everybody lives up to that faith necessarily. Not everybody acts, quote unquote, morally all the time. But I do believe that there are more good people in our society than there are bad people. You know, we have a lot of people, we have millions of people. So maybe those bad apples kind of, they're more prevalent, or you're more aware of them. Maybe that's the media, the way the media does things. Like, there's a lot of reasons why we might have this opinion that people are immoral nowadays, but I'm not convinced that that's the case. I'm convinced that the leadership is. Like, that, on that point, we're in agreement.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that the society.
I mean, I'll just say that I think the reason why people are, or one of the reasons why people possibly are afraid of some sort of cohesion between education and theology, or whatever you want to call it, faith, is because we've all grown up in a really defunct education system. So of course, in my initial discovery of faith, like, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe the school lied to me for 8 years. I mean, what on earth were they teaching? And at first you reject all of that because you're like, this is ridiculous. We've been lied to. But that's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That's my question.
I'm talking about a good education. And
Now I have a question, Nick. I have a question. So, what then? Could you tell us what you think? Like, what would that look like? Like, what would a theology in a society, that, I mean, the way that you're describing it?
Oh God, big one. All right, let me try. Why not? I actually want to be a teacher one day. Not right now, I'm not ready, but one day. So this will be some sort of preparation.
I only asked because you know what it isn't.
Go on.
You know what it isn't. I mean, from
right.
trying to pull it out from you, you seem to know what it isn't.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
what is it?
Yeah, I had I had a good education. So yeah, I do know what it isn't, because even with that good education, I was deeply unsatisfied as a young man, and yeah. So I would say that, you know, like in today, you know, I'm going to try my best. Forgive me if I fail, but you know, in subjects, everything is, schools are separated, children are separated, people are put into class groups by age, by number, everything's numerical. Intelligence is dictated by numbers, grades, standards, outcome-based education. Everything is about the outcome, not the process. So in a school, should we really be teaching children like this? I don't think so. I think children should be taught in a way which has a lot more freedom of their own innate expression. I believe that there is a genius inside each and every one of us, and I know that's hard to believe in the sense perceptive world, but I really honestly believe that every child has a light in them, and that first and foremost, the teacher must listen to the student and hear the light. Try and see the light before you try and imprint your education on the child, and let the child make a decision as to what they wish to learn. Because every child that I engage with has questions, natural born questions inside of themselves. So teachers, they stand today at the front of classes with books. I would love to see teachers stood at the front of a class with nothing but ears, and actually talking to the children and having a conversation. I think we've gotten to a place where we are so far away from what an education actually is. It should be a dialogue of sorts, and I don't think it should be separated as such into specific subjects as though they're treated different, because they're not. There's actually no difference. Intellect is intellect.
Right.
But at the end of the day, why are we splitting it into maths, science, art? And then children, they become very good at, you know, people in general, they become very good at those parts, but they have no way of relating back to the whole. They have no understanding of how they are part of the greater clock. And so whenever they then fall out of school, I mean, in university, it does get better. It does get, like, you know, a little bit better, and adults are kind of treated as adults and allowed to make some sort of choices about as to which and what they learn. But, you know, even still, like, you know, I've been living with a student in the past months, and the professor's telling him, like, you need to learn critical thinking. And the student's like, well, teach me. And the professor's like, no, go do it yourself. Now, that's in McGill, right? You live in a world where, of course, it's going to be hard for me to right now give you the physical parameters as to how a school like that would look, but it will look completely different to what today. Subjects will not be split into separate entities. Education will be taught as a whole rather than a part. And then once the kid has decided out what part they wish to endeavor, go for it. You know, the sky's the limit. Go for it. Take what you will and, you know, shoot for the light. But first, we must let them choose. We must give the child, treat them as adults before they are adults, and say, here's your base, here's your foundation, here's your morality. And then now, out of this, we're going to learn a bunch of different things that are the foundations of these pillars of education. And then after, you guys, you choose as to which one resonates in your soul the most. But they're going to understand from a very young age that that part, whatever part they choose, is going to, in the end, relate back to the whole. That the only reason they're studying that part to the greatest possible sense is that they must bring it back to the whole. Otherwise, why are they doing it? Why do anything? If it's not for the greater good, why do anything at all?
On that note, there's something interesting that Kwan, he wrote in. I don't know if, I think everyone can see it.
Yeah.
In the Zoom group chat, where I'll just read it, where he says, and that does flow off of what you were saying, Nick, in some ways, many ways. on the question of the greater good and the whole, this question of morality. But he wrote, it depends at which spiritual station you are in. The more capable you are, the more you're capable of evil. In Plato's Republic, the prisoner, just before going outside to the sun, he passes by the platform of the puppeteers. That's the last temptation, to join the oligarchs. So the ultimate problem is always the selection of leaders and how to regulate them. Is that it? And how to regulate. Yeah, which the whole of the Republic is based upon how do you educate the guardians of your society, right? Which is sort of the theme of the Republic as a whole. What type of educational system is needed so that you have that balance of every positive attribute without the destructive aspects taking the lead.
I think like to what you're saying, Nick, and it's something that I personally spent a lot of my thinking time on. I think in early education, the fundamentally beautiful and optimistic early education, so young children, kindergarten to whatever, elementary school. I think there's a little, I think it's difficult to teach kids at that age knowledge, but it's very easy to teach them skills. And I think that if an early education system looked something like music, arts, and physical education, you would have a basic foundation for these young kids to know in themselves that they're capable of something. Because I think that what's the first obstacle towards education? It's confidence. It's knowing that you actually can learn something, that you're capable of learning something. And I think that what are the easiest things, and they're hard, they're not actually easy, but they are the easiest things that we can do, is, be creative, learn an instrument, be physical, be in good shape, learn how to paint or write poetry, right? And these fundamental basic skills that we can teach kids, I think will then flow into the higher moralizing questions. And I think, because right, this is definitely something we've all had conversations about, like a classical education, having classical music, having classical art, all of these things that without directly saying it to us somehow moralizes us as individuals, and I think so something I personally I feel as a kid who had a lot of energy, there was not enough gym class. They should have been running me 3 hours in the morning and I would have been great. I could have sat for the whole class, so I think it's you're right, it's so backwards the way that we're teaching kids.
I was just thinking about when we a few months ago when we got together at Patrick's house for a music abend, and Patrick showed us this giant telescope that he built when he was 16, 17 years old, right? He spent 2 years building this gigantic, massive telescope. And he took us through also some of his geometric studies, because he had to make his own lens, right? His own, using elliptic functions, and that took a lot of math to figure out the proper curvature of the lenses inside the telescope. He had to build the damn thing. So there's a lot to go through, and I was just thinking to myself, well, what if you organize the school system around the goal of building a telescope, which doesn't just involve the final product of the telescope, but you have to learn, for a reason all of a sudden, these various trigonometric functions. You have to learn these various skills of optics along the way to the goal. So that the goal, by the time you have the telescope, you've got a whole new set of powers that you've cultivated in yourself that are not built on memorization. But you can now apply that to a variety of other things that you put your mind to or inspired to do, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's like that movie that you so greatly shared with us, the October Sky.
Oh, October Sky. Yeah, right.
That's an example.
The kid in the coal mining town, right, who wants to be an astronomer.
And they're 14, 13?
Something like that, yeah.
Just teenagers. Wow, they made a rocket.
Right.
I think Pascal just sent a message.
Yeah? Who just said that?
Yeah, no, sorry, I just see that Pascal had sent a message.
Oh.
I had a thought.
Hold on, wait. Dave, 1 sec. Pascal, I don't know why I didn't say that out loud. What did he say?
So he said, to me, it echoes what was discussed during the reading of Plato's Timaeus as to why the American political system is the best we've had as of yet, in the separation of power and need for enlightened leaders and educated citizens to counter everyone's vices.
Huh.
Yeah.
Dave, did you, that's a good point.
Yeah, kind of just to synthesize all the kind of things I think we're talking about. Or one thing I've noticed is that different people are good at different things. And that's also a thing. That the idea that, so whenever we're talking about a standard education system, it's probably going to have to take into account that different people do excel in different things. So how do you want to create a situation, or regardless, okay, different people excel in different things, and you want everybody's potential to be developed as much as humanly possible. So how do you create an education system which, first off, recognizes this universal spark, which all this multiplicity of talents and whatnot partake in, whether it's leadership. I think that's another paradox with the Plato thing, is that leadership itself is perhaps a quality that, when you say, how do we form the leaders? Well, there's really a question of, well, who has this leadership quality? What defines it? And to find it in people. So yeah, there is this universal idea of creativity, right? This divine spark that, we're talking about religion or how do you raise children with an idea of faith and whatnot. There's this idea of intrinsic goodness, this intrinsic creative spark that everyone has. And there's the excitement around wanting to develop that, and each person developing it in their own unique way. So if we start with the idea that this thing exists and that it's demonstrable, then the exciting part for each person becomes, how are they going to develop it in themselves? How are they going to express it in their own unique way? And so the education system is there to provoke that. And then I guess practically, when we're talking about a classical education system, why does it work so well? It's because it does that. And it has a multitude of different aspects from the languages, right? There's a heavy emphasis on languages, on music. Having exposure to all these things allows for the full spectrum of potential qualities that people have to be kindled and aroused. So that's, I find interesting, just as a paradoxical idea, the best leaders aren't necessarily the most moral. I don't think, from what I've seen, if we look at even the most recent cases, whether it's Kennedy, Donald Trump, or whatnot, I only say that in the sense that they have a quality of leadership. And a quality of leadership is something very particular and special. And you need morality. But the point is that these people, leadership is its own quality. And you want to find that in those people. And yes, you want to train them a certain way. But I guess that, because I just find it almost elitist, right? To say, how do we train leaders? It's not how do we train leaders, but how do you find these different qualities in different people? Some people may be smarter, but they're not necessarily leaders.
Napoleon has strong leadership qualities there, Dave. Would you say that he falls under, how does he play into what you've just said?
Oh, well, you can demonstrate that what he's doing is obviously doing a lot of harm. Doesn't mean he didn't have good leadership qualities, but he used it for evil. I'm just saying there's a skill.
Yeah, but you want to keep things in their right proportion, because obviously,
of course,
like one leads and the other follows, and you need skills to be a good scientist as much as a good painter or a good political leader. But the skills, I would say, you want to make sure that they're not primary to the moral instincts and integrity of the person, but that the moral instincts and integrity is primary. Not to say that they're angels, but I'm just saying that you want to make sure that that's the lead.
The intent to do good, of course, but like, why do people?
Because the path of hell really is paved by often good intentions.
No, but with like Trump, right? What do most Trump supporters say? Nobody thinks he's a great, he's the most, infallible person, right? There's actually a humanness that they like and relate to, but they say he's a good leader and what he wants to do is good. Like he really cares about America, and what he wants to do is take America back to, you know, a certain idea of progress. But most people who support him say, we know this guy isn't, like, you know, the best example, or as you even joke, Matt, like you wouldn't want him as a friend. You know, he's not the kind of guy that you want as a friend, but he's good. You know, he'd just be talking about himself the whole time, but he's a good leader. I think it's an interesting paradox that we find these kinds of
Assad just wrote something to the group that I think sort of plays on this. Assad writes, can morality be relative, varying from person to person, situation to situation, culture to culture?
No.
Good answer.
No,
I
would like to jump in on that question that Assad posed. I would suggest that there's you know, multiple layers of morality, but there is a core morality that's based in truth. However, you might be in a culture where, like here in Serbia, like not taking your shoes off is like a faux pas, but like a person might say this is like a sign of an immoral person even, or an uncultured person that's prone to other immoralities. It's a bad signifier of poor virtue. Or there may be things like, you know, whether you, you know, premarital sex and things like this, which really don't always necessarily relate to the core issue of truth and don't mean that a person is like a bad person per se. So I would suggest that there's like the word morality has become very vague and in language, but that the core of morality is, agreeing with Aaron, is universal in culture to culture. And I would suggest, honestly, that there is a direct connection between logic and truth and morality. And I would suggest that the biggest problem now, as it's been said, that most people are good, but we are being led by absolute psychopaths who know that they're bad, but they are teaching a wrong, like we're talking about education, they're teaching a wrong theory of how we ascertain what the truth is. And so most people, not most people, but many people are confused. And so they will follow the psychopath's conception or vision, whether they are, you know, in daycare or law enforcement or the military, and they will, let's say, obey unlawful orders because they're confused about what is good. So, but if we teach, as Nick was sort of etching out in his idea of what an education system might look like, we would, you know, the friend of yours who his professor said, well, you got to learn critical thinking. That has come to mean something crazy. But if I were to be generous with the idea, I would say that we would learn like logic and rhetoric and what used to be called like the trivium at an early age. And then as in Plato's Republic, I know we always freaking bring up this freaking book, but in Plato's Republic, there's a there's a dialogue with Glaucon, who like wants to be like a leader. So he's saying like, but first, to be like a philosopher king, you have to like first be the philosopher king over your own self, which is like the higher self versus the lower self, right? Like you must conquer yourself. Like when you were saying that you're like coming to faith moment was really the conquest of your higher self over your lower self, right? So that's like what we all kind of have to have, that transformative experience that you've had, right? And when we learn logic and rhetoric and what is true, then we can actually see, like in that movie, they put the glasses on, they can see, right? Then we can see like the lies, like clear as day, right? So that's what I would like, you know, I would say that's Then from there, like later education, you have like the quadrivium, and you have like, in the Carolingian Renaissance was like, which brought Europe up like in the, whatever was it, like the 6th century, all the way up into, the medieval, up into the medieval period, was based in this like Platonic concept of the 7 arts. And then from there, like people, like you said, choose medicine, architecture, things like this, but you have to have that foundation in what is true. Yeah. So that's how that's how I kind of have it, like in my like, crazy head, but that's, that's me.
Yeah. I would just like to add that the only reason I had to overcome that was because I was educated badly.
Boom.
So I was always, too many compliments are not good for people, and you end up losing that divinity in you that you're born with, and you become an asshole. Just to put it bluntly. And if you're not educated like that, and people don't, blow steam up your ass, as we say in England, like you wouldn't have those evil.
But is having been an asshole, as you were, is that like a little bit like what Quan Le was saying about like having been, like maybe a person has to have been rich, or for some people the path is that they had been rich, to understand that that's not the thing either.
Yeah, I mean, of course, in a system like this, definitely. But if we change it at the root, no.
This sort of reminds me of a poem that Schiller wrote, which was turned into a song called Speisen de Vega, 2 are the way, which Pascal knows well, and Brigitte too. But that essentially the poem is, I'm not going to read, Speisen de Vega, auch welchen de Ven. No, anyway, it basically is that there's 2 paths to virtue, and one is through practice and suffering, and the other is through theory and the mind. And if one is blocked off from you, you always have the other one, and you'll get the same effect, but blessed is he who has both.
Yeah.
Now, that might be a little taken out of context, because ultimately...
That's interesting.
Does the suffering need to happen in life? Do you have to live it out? Or could it be by our very act of being human with sympathetic powers to vicariously experience the suffering of somebody in a tragedy, in a play, or in a history lesson, right? You can sort of put yourself through the tribulations of a Martin Luther King Jr. or something like that, and feel it if you're doing it honestly, and learn through the fire that they went through in some way, so that you don't have to necessarily go through exactly what, I'm not saying Martin Luther King made those types of, I'm not saying that he's a person of vice, but I'm just saying, like, we can't be Martin Luther King. That was him. He lived his life, and he did it in a way which is a model, a role model for many people. So could that supplement the type of experience that Schiller is talking about? So you don't just have a theory of virtue and theory of morality, which might get good behavioral effects, but it doesn't have the spirit, versus, the actual tempering of the spirit, putting it through the fire in a way which, doesn't involve you killing somebody.
Yeah.
But it can be reenacted in the theater.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And I would encourage, anyone who hasn't seen it, like Christine's class on the role of tragedy in people's lives.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick.
That was brilliant. Actually, like the day I came to that, I had a really profound discovery in myself. So, it just is.
And Kenneth Branagh had to destroy Hamlet in order to make that discovery happen. He had to be the negative proof. So there was some good that came out of Kenneth Branagh's idiotic rendition of Shakespeare.
That's what I'm learning with Kusa right now. Kusa says, out of the one comes the many, and in the many you will find the bad as well as the good. And that's the thing. Even when you read the bad guys like Rousseau or whatever, you're going to learn something about how insane they were. So there's good in that, because you learn, like, oh God, don't want to do that. or like if you read Adam Smith's Free Trade or anything of that, and you don't have to read too much of it until you come to the conclusion that Aristotle was a nutter. Like, and that's really great, because you know you don't want to have blind faith. You also don't want to have blind knowledge. You want to know that like what Plato is saying is right, that it's not just a feeling, that it is actually something intelligible. And
I'll just add to that it's not that Plato is right, it's that in spirit he understood. And I know I keep going back to that because I think we all do, like I do it myself, where it's like we gain a knowledge about something, we learn something, and we think we truly understand it, but we don't in its essence. And I think morality and like living a good life, to this point of like, do you have to sin to know what is morally right? I don't think so. Like, it's not given that you do, but it's most likely that you will, right? It's most likely that we will all, no matter how good of an education we've had, you know, we'll probably do something in our lives that is immoral, and that will cause us to really step back and say, okay, wait a second, forget what I've been taught, but I need to relook at myself, you know, like I forget who mentioned it earlier, but essentially like creating like the philosopher king. I think it was it was the first time we're meeting.
It was Jay. It was wacky.
Yeah, okay, Jay. So yeah, like, you know, essentially that, you know, I think this in part of something I've heard Jordan Peterson say about, that we can't be our own dictators, right? We can't tell ourselves to do something and then we do it. We kind of have to go through these negotiations with ourselves. And I think if we're going to discuss an education, and kind of partly going back to what Dave said, because I do think that sometimes like people are born with certain natural qualities, and you want to allow for those qualities to flourish, but what you want to provide everyone across the board is a foundation to have that kind of dialogue within themselves, right? A foundation where they're able to kind of have this internal dialogue and I'm losing the words, but I guess that was fundamentally my point, because, you know, like I will never be a dancer. I have terrible, you know, hand-eye coordination, but I can be moral, you know, I can get there.
Yeah, I think it bears down in relation to that. Like I would, you know, just say, do we want the individual to be bigger than the state? Do we want to live in a world where individuals are glorified more than the nation itself? So you know, we bear down to this thing of like morality again, as we're talking, and reason, and why we're doing it. Is it for ourselves or is it for everyone? And
can it be both?
It can be. I think it is in essence. But if you start with it, just have. So, but when I think like not what necessarily I think, but like what's the greater good of a school? What's the greater good? What's the best possible outcome for everyone? Not for the single individual where they start.
Yeah.
For everyone. How does everyone find the genius, or like Dave was saying, the light, or the particular talent in themselves? Well, first we must say, you know, teach the basic foundation of the whole as best we can, and provide them that very strong basis where then they go out, investigate the parts through the, you know, the course of their education. But because they stepped off originally from a platform that was derived out of the greater good, they will come back home, so to speak. They will return to base, where it is safe, where it is secure, where they have confidence, where they know they're loved, and they love back. Because I'm not doing it for me, I'm doing it for everyone. And so in states, you know, in the West today, you have celebrity culture, you have popular culture, you know, fame, fortune. In China, it's different. It's very much about the state. It's, you know, they have a system set up where the individuals do not become bigger than the you know, the parts don't become bigger than the whole. The parts function for the whole.
But I would say that the responsibility still falls on the individual. And I think in education, right, like if we're talking about a curriculum or a system, you're right, 100%. We can't always be concerned about the individual, or maybe that's not the right way of putting it, but we can't cater, because I would say that's the failure of our current education system to a certain degree, is that we are trying to generalize education as much as possible. But that when I think of like the way you're describing society, I can only think like the closest thing, like what the greater good is. So, or my friends, right, have that same type of kind of agapic, frankly, might not have the same feelings towards me and might even have any destruction towards me, right? So it's.
Can put something? Sorry. Yeah, it reaches me very well personally now for 2 years. And it's really not easy because we get into situations where students, so it's not that many compared to what we have in the South, in Montreal, that's the South for me now. So I have very few students compared to what my colleagues have, but all of my students are at different levels. They manage somehow because, well, we let them, go on quite a lot, do anything. Doesn't mean that they will fulfill, the curricula, the vision that we have for them. I don't know how to say it in English. I forget the word.
Requirement.
Les attentes, what we're waiting for them to basically reach as,
expectation,
test or whatever, expectation. That's it. All right, thanks. So I have a problem because, they are at different levels. So I try to teach them, whatever, history or French. And I'm trying to get the best ones to actually help the ones that have a problem. But, the hard thing is that the ones who got it, who are at the higher level, let's put it like this, they will just give the answer to the other one. And that's just, well, okay, now you have the answer. That's great. But you're going to fail in the test because you don't know how to get the answer.
Yeah.
So that's a very hard thing to do. Like, this is what I grapple with all the time. I could just give them the answer and, all right, you go on with your life and, you have the paper.
Yeah.
You now have passed to the higher echelons, But what does it mean? It's, it's just blind faith, it's a mathematical structure that you create. And in the end, nobody knows how it was built because it just doesn't function. It doesn't work. It's hard to get the one on top to help the one, that are under. That's the hard part. That's really, if you want to be a teacher one day, I would about it because I have still a hard time with it.
I have a comment that you just generated, Pascal, which is, hi everybody, I'm Scott. But the question is, these are people living in they're isolated from what we'll call developed society, what we might call that, okay, in some way, in large ways, and they have their history and background. And I was just thinking, here we are with schools trying to educate them and so on, and part of their culture is quite different, than what we experience and that we live in. And I'm just thinking, here we are, we could have plans like Diefenbaker, the Northern Vision, and we could come in and say, you need this, like this is part of the greater good, for society at large, and yet we have to have those people on board in some way, part of that thing, because even if they were, and in some way. I'm just thinking like if they're not part of the process, they're not, then they're alienated from it. And what do we get when, you know, when people feel alienated from, you know, such a process, you know? So I'm just thoughts coming to mind. And so what should our education, can our education intervene on that? Could it help with that? Should it? These kind of things.
Yeah.
Well, you know, that's
same with
that's
Africa. Same with Africa.
That's good questions. Yeah. I don't know if I can answer it right now. I think I'm gonna have to go pretty soon, but just, you know, going back to different things I've heard tonight, I would say, I don't know, it's a saying I've heard somewhere. I don't know if somebody can find out who said it. But, you know, there was this question of, do you have to sin to know what is wrong, or, you know, to find out, you know, your morality and act accordingly. And somebody said somewhere that, you know, you can learn from your mistakes. That's good. Now, what's wise is to learn from somebody else's mistakes. You know, so you don't have to repeat it. And you know, that goes hand in hand with what we were discussing with theater, you know?
Yeah.
I think that's the idea. I'm gonna have to look at what Cynthia has done because I think I missed that one. But you know, the tragic in theater, it doesn't mean that people won't live tragedies in their lives. Always happens and always will. But you don't necessarily have to make everybody else's mistake to become better. You know, you could, there's a way to learn and reason, and you're gonna make mistakes anyway. That's how we learn, and I'm trying to teach my students that way. You know, I'm trying to make as many mistakes as I can when I teach them. And, well, and hopefully they catch my mistakes. But I try to make as many as I can because they are from a tradition, from a culture which says you don't try to do it until you know you're going to get it right. Because that was and I, you know, from looking at their history, you can figure it out. But that was the only way the group would survive. Is that if you do something and it fails,
without knowing how to build an igloo, you're dead.
That's it. Yeah, or you know, or hunting or whatever. You know, every component of your life has to do with survival. That's what they had to deal with all the time.
Yeah.
And so if, you know, you would learn by imitation, but there's very limited degree, which is that you would see the other one do again and again and again and again and again. And then once the elder, or, you know, your mentor, usually the dad for the son and the mother for the girls, once they would think that you could do it on your own, they would let you try. And they tell you, you know, this is wrong, don't do that ever again. And that's how they would learn, you know. So it would take a lot of time for them to actually get to even try. So that's what I'm confronted with, and it's very hard to break. So I, you know, sometimes they find me silly because I try to make it, you know, I'm making silly mistakes about, you know, very obvious things, and they like to correct me, but, you know, then it makes sense that they will make mistakes too.
I just wanted to add something. LaRouche has in the United States summer camps for children from the age of 8 on to learn about science. And I heard it's very important to introduce kids already at the age of 8, so they will get excited about the next day. They start already making discoveries, and So he had actually a science magazine for children too, where parents could do certain exercises with their children. And
You know what? Kids are already little scientists, you know?
yeah, but I mean, you want to teach them how to find the truth, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And also there are other models, like in Germany, the Alexander or Wilhelm von Humboldt education system, which has produced a lot of great scientists in Germany. And all that was thrown out in the same time. They started with free trade, you know, in 71. But there are great models actually out there. So anyways.
And von Humboldt as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, what about the great vision that Kennedy had with the Peace Corps, whereby youth get an experience to, after they've got some grounding in their own culture, to experience other cultures and get a sense of the world at large, and in a productive way, and learning skills and whatnot.
Traveling.
It's all, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but setting up shop, as it were, and in an area where they, get to know the people there, and they get to know the culture.
Yeah.
And the language, maybe.
When I become president, there will be, how do you say that? Military service, obligatory military service.
Don't you have to be an American?
And that's what they will do. That's my program.
Sounds great. Sounds great.
Don't you have to overthrow the
I
monarchy
will vote for you.
a republic, then, Pascal? Is that what you're saying?
That's just a detail, Matt. But to reply also to Nick, I don't remember exactly what was your. Oh yeah, your question was about the individual over the state.
Yeah.
Why? Yeah, my answer would be framed in this way. I would say it would be a mistake to put the individual on top of the state. Not because you want to devalue the individual's part, but because it would be really a maybe a prejudice, or I don't know, it would be denying basically our past, because the state and what we are today is because of other people who built and others who built upon them and upon them and upon them. So basically we are as if on the shoulders of giants. We have to learn from them before we think we can overthrow everything and just do our own thing. That's what I would say right now.
Yeah, great. I totally agree.
I think about Schiller, though, when you bring that up, and I can't remember where he mentions this, but that the state as the ends, where does he talk about this?
In the Ascetical Letters?
Is it in the Ascetical Letters? But he mentions that that the education of the state essentially being as like the end goal. I'm misremembering right now, but I remember there's something in there. I'm sure you can help me out with this.
It's on the, I believe it's on the purpose of the state, and when it loses the legitimacy and right to rule is when it becomes destructive of the powers of human creativity, and that it was designed to be the instrument to enhance. So the state exists for the purpose of enhancing and multiplying the powers of our inner lights, right, of our creative powers. And when the state becomes disruptive of that, it loses its I guess you could say in the Chinese philosophy, I don't know how Schiller words it, but he talks about it, like you could say it loses its mandate of heaven.
And because it must
in a
be
way,
overcome.
I've got one.
Yeah, that's actually, Christine just found it. It's from the his Universal History lecture on the comparison of the constitutions of Lycurgus's Sparta and Solon's Athens, which is a wonderful little lecture where he says literally The state itself is never the purpose. It is important only as the condition under which the purpose of mankind may be fulfilled. And this purpose of mankind is none other than the development of all of the powers of the people, i.e. progress. If the constitution of a state hinders the progress of the mind, it is contemptible and harmful, however well thought out it may otherwise be. In general, we can establish a rule for judging political institutions, that they are only good and laudable to the extent that they bring all forces inherent in persons to flourish, to the extent that they promote the progress of culture, or at least do not hinder it. This rule applies to religious laws as well as to political ones. Both are contemptible if they constrain a power of the human mind, if they impose upon the mind any sort of stagnation.
Yeah.
And so the United States put in their constitution the right to bear arms.
Among other things, yeah.
So that they could always make the choice to overthrow that which would become a tyrannical government.
Oh yeah, right. That's even built into the founding document.
I think that's a Jeffersonian interpretation of the Second Amendment. I think that's a Jeffersonian interpretation of the Second Amendment of this, because that's something that Locke talks about, right? Locke talks about the right to revolution in a free society. It's not. I'm not so convinced. I'm not so convinced that the Second Amendment was designed as like a safeguard towards tyrannical government. It's not so self-evident to me, at least.
Joaquin wants to speak. Wait, hold on. Joaquin, I think you got something you want to say to this?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. Just on the Second Amendment, and then the thing with the state and the individual. There's a lot. There's like so much out there on the Second Amendment and its origins, and like the history on it is, it's an emotional question, and people are invested in it. And so it can be hard to want to see that milk in the refrigerator. But the thing is that there was like a number of events from the Articles of Confederation onwards, and there was a lot of open territory, and there were different Native American tribes to varying extents of let's say friendliness with the settler colonists or whatever. So the Second Amendment was involved a lot of things, but it certainly wasn't about like overthrowing the government. But it also wasn't about limiting the arms to like, it's not about hunting either, right? So it's not about like the scope of the arms isn't supposed to be like hunting rifles. I mean, if there's like at the time of the Second Amendment, arms included, and you would look at the precedent of common law usage, even in England, even going back like 100, 200, 300 years, because that was like what was in play. Like that was the legal language of the time of the founding fathers. So like arms means like they had like early forms of machine guns, they had grenades, they had like rockets and stuff like that. It wasn't like just muskets and stuff, right? So that's all in fair play in arms, in militias and well-regulated militias. The language is like really clear, but the historical context is also really clear. The Supreme Court, like the amicus briefs that have been filed and all of the, like it's all in the state gov, the record of the Supreme Court in the US, so they're all online. You can see like all of the different arguments that have been made every time it's been challenged in court, the Second Amendment. So I'm not saying that governments don't need to be overthrown, but or that having arms makes it easier to do that. I'm just saying it's not why they had that provision. About the state and the individual, it's a lot like, in my view, it's a really similar question to actually the state and religion. So we tend to think of the individual versus the state, but it's like, it's almost imagining that there wouldn't be a power, or power wouldn't exist if there wasn't a state. Of course there would be power. It would be like the power of very powerful individuals who have power over you. So the point of, so it's like the individual is actually protected through the state, right? And the state is like the mediator that stands above the individual whims and prejudices and proclivities and random desires. Like Bill Gates says, vaccinate everybody or whatever, just for instance, right? So that's like, the state is supposed to actually protects the individual from other individuals. So that's just that's my 2 cents on that. I'll go back on mute. Thank you.
I like that microphone there.
Yeah, I was thinking about as well Joaquin is a veteran podcaster.
Yeah, I need a microphone like that too.
I think we all do. What I was going to say though is that this sort of reminds me a little bit of like what Joaquin just said, and also what Pascal had said earlier, of the American system and its original intention. Because when you read, and I think a lot of us here have read the writings of Alexander Hamilton, especially on the subject of manufactures, or even Frederick List, right, who coined the term the American system in the 1830s. But Hamilton's very clear that the purpose of a state and an economy, it's called political economy. It's not politics and economics. It was understood as one thing. Yeah. And the purpose of the state was to increase and multiply the objects of enterprise in order for the creative faculties of the mind to have greater opportunities to find their talents. And that's why he made the argument that when you increase the division of labor through industrial activity and infrastructure and science investments, which was very much in opposition to the Lockean sort of like the ethic of the Confederate South that was much more based on slave labor and cash cropping, which defined wealth in a very materialistic way, right? Of human labor, money. Whereas the Hamiltonian, the North, when they were obeying these principles, it was more of a process of investing in ways that always allowed you to have rail. And when you built the railroad somewhere, you also built new industries along the way. You created all of these secondary and tertiary new industries that never would have existed had you not done the railway. Kind of like the telescope, right? By building the telescope over the course of a year or two, you develop all of these capabilities you didn't have before you started the project or going to the moon. Same sort of thing. So the placement of value in the increasing process of the mind also informs your education system, because then you have to have a very flexible education system in that society that's always able to produce students who, when they go out into the workforce, are not just being cogs in a machine, but are highly adaptable to the completely new sort of topography of technological activity, which is now existing in that society when the child is an adult, that wasn't there when they started their education in kindergarten, right? So you have, as your society is always moving in a way that is self-perfecting, the education system is increasingly taking on and by those adaptive creative tendencies. And if you stagnate or you start going backwards, like Schiller said, when the state starts behaving in a way that causes the mind to stagnate or regress, the education system and everything else will reflect that regression. And to the point that you have like Bill Gates also like investing in Common Core, like not even investing in, he's like running Common Core to like lobotomize a whole generation of young people to make them really good slaves, So if you could save your creativity by like avoiding whatever the hell they might be putting in vaccines under Bill Gates's agenda, then you still have Common Core to capture all of the fish that fall out of that net. Not to say I'm against vaccines entirely, but I mean, it gets shady. But yeah, you definitely want to have a constant appreciation for process instead of just an object fixation in a state or an economy.
Sorry, I just wanted to say one more thing, just because I have to leave as well. And it's back to the individual and the state question. And I guess as we were all talking, the word harmony kind of just kept kind of playing in my head, that I think rather than the question or the answer being putting one on top of the other, it's finding a way to create a sense of harmony between the two. Right. And it's essentially in developing in an individual vision for themselves within that society. Right. Because you're right. Like it can't just be individualistic like we've done today, right? The kind of liberal individualism, hyper individualism, consumerist, however you define it. But I also don't think you want to go to the other extreme of like the more communist kind of socialist direction, where the state is this like divine entity to a certain degree, and self-sacrifice is necessary to preserve that state. Self-sacrifice is necessary sometimes, but I think it's developing essentially that type of sense of individuality within the community or within the greater whole of your society. And maybe in part why I keep thinking about it, because like a state to me seems like a very concrete structure. Society, culture, those are things that I think are much more important than the individual, because that's exactly what you are. You are made up of those things. That's your background. That's your core. But the state it's a thing that kind of what Jay was saying earlier, like we need the state to protect us from each other to a certain degree. Again, that's kind of a liberal interpretation of what human beings are. But yeah, we do need state structures. We do need governments. We do need these entities. But those state structures are also made up of individuals, and it's important that those individuals see themselves in those roles, not as acting for themselves, but as acting for the greater good of that society or that state.
All right. On that note, I'm gonna have to say goodbye.
Yeah, me
Thanks
too.
a lot. It was really
Guys,
nice to
yeah.
see you all.
Thank you, man.
Absolutely, yeah, guys, and Aaron, thank you so much for devoting your time as
Yeah.
well to showcase Gestalt. Very cool.
Pleasure.
Thank
Thank you, Aaron.
And yeah, I guess we're gonna cut out to next week. So just so you guys all know, like usual, we're gonna do the reading of Theaetetus by Plato, part 3 on Thursday, and then next Sunday, Christine or myself will deliver our part of the conference, either on Cicero's fight to save the soul of the Republic, and what that was about, or something on Khazaria and the Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Confucian alliance of the 8th century that has been written out of our history books. So one of those things, 2 things will happen next week, and then we'll have Assad coming online following Sunday on the Arab Renaissance principle. So that should be, and we might have new things after that come online. Who knows?
Maybe Joaquin wants to do
Maybe
a presentation.
Yeah, maybe Joaquin presentation. Yes.
Great.
Well, thanks everybody for the call. It's what a fantastic time to listen to.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
It was 3.5 hours, went by faster than normal.
I got beat of the
Oh, take care, guys.
Take care.
Ciao.
Bye.